Chapter 21 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Hengst. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 21. The Story of the Fair Circassians. We were born in Circassia of poor people, and my sister's name is Tazila and mine Deli. Having nothing but our beauty to help us in life, we were carefully trained in all the accomplishments that give pleasure. We were both quick to learn, and from our childhood could play all sorts of instruments, could sing, and above all could dance. We were, besides, lively and merry, as in spite of our misfortunes we are to this day. We were easily pleased, and quite content with our lives at home, when one morning the officials who had been sent to find wives for the Sultan saw us, and were struck with our beauty. We had always expected something of the sort, and were resigned to our lot, when we chanced to see two young men enter our house. The elder, who was about 20 years of age, had black hair and very bright eyes. The other could not have been more than 15, and was so fair that he might easily have passed for a girl. They knocked at the door with a timid air, and begged our parents to give them shelter, as they had lost their way. After some hesitation their request was granted, and they were invited into the room in which we were. And if our parents' hearts were touched by their beauty, our own were not any harder, so that our departure for the palace, which had been arranged for the next day, suddenly became intolerable to us. Night came, and I awoke from my sleep to find the younger of the two strangers sitting at my bedside, and felt him take my hand. "Fear nothing, lovely Deli," he whispered, "from one who never knew love till he saw you. My name," he went on, "is Prince Delicate, and I am the son of the King of the Isle of Black Marble. My friend, who travels with me, is one of the richest nobles of my country, and the secrets which he knows are the envy of the Sultan himself. And we left our native country because my father wished me to marry a lady of great beauty, but with one eye a trifle smaller than the other." My vanity was flattered at so speedy a conquest, and I was charmed with the way the young man had declared his passion. I turned my eyes slowly on him, and the look I gave him caused him almost to lose his senses. He fell fainting forward, and I was unable to move till Tazila, who had hastily put on a dress, ran to my assistance, together with Thelamis, the young noble of whom the prince had spoken. As soon as we were all ourselves again, we began to bewail our fate, and the journey that we were to take that very day to Constantinople. But we felt a little comforted when Thelamis assured us that he and the prince would follow in our steps, and would somehow contrive to speak to us. Then they kissed our hands, and left the house by a side way. A few moments later our parents came to tell us that the escort had arrived, and having taken farewell of them, we mounted the camels, and took our seats in a kind of box that was fixed to the side of the animal. These boxes were large enough for us to sleep in comfortably, and as there was a window in the upper part, we were able to see the country through which we passed. For several days we journeyed on, feeling sad and anxious as to what might become of us, when one day, as I was looking out of the window of our room, I heard my name called, and beheld a beautifully dressed girl jumping out of the box on the other side of our camel. One glance told me that it was the prince, and my heart bounded with joy. It was, he said, Thelamis's idea to disguise him like this, and that he himself had assumed the character of a slave dealer who was taking this peerless maiden as a present to the Sultan. Thelamis had also persuaded the officer in charge of the caravan to let him hire the vacant box, so it was easy for the prince to scramble out of his own window and approach ours. This ingenious trick enchanted us, but our agreeable conversation was soon interrupted by the attendants, who perceived that the camel was walking in a crooked manner, and came out to find out what was wrong. Luckily they were slow in their movements, and the prince had just time to get back to his box and restore the balance before the trick was discovered. But neither the prince nor his friend had any intention of allowing us to enter the Sultan's palace, though it was difficult to know how we were to escape, and what was to become of us once we had escaped. At length, one day, as we were drawing near Constantinople, we learned from the prince that Thelamis had made acquaintance with a holy dervish, whom we had met on the road, and had informed him that we were his sisters, who were being sold as slaves against his will. The good man was interested in the story, and readily agreed to find us shelter if we could manage to elude the watchfulness of our guards. The risk was great, but it was our only chance. That night, when the whole caravan was fast asleep, we raised the upper part of our boxes and by the help of Thelamis climbed silently out. We next went back some distance along the way we had come, and then, striking into another road, reached at last the retreat prepared for us by the dervish. Here we found food and rest, and I need not say what happiness it was to be free once more. The dervish soon became a slave to our beauty, and the day after our escape he proposed that we should allow him to conduct us to an inn situated at a short distance, where we should find two Jews, owners of precious talismans which did not really belong to them. "Try," said the dervish, "by some means to get possession of them." The inn, though not on the direct road to Constantinople, was a favorite one with merchants, owing to the excellence of the food, and on our arrival we discovered at least 6 or 8 other people who had stopped for refreshment. They greeted us politely, and we sat down to table together. In a short time the 2 men described by the dervish entered the room, and at a sign from him my sister made room at her side for one, while I did the same for the other. Now the dervish had happened to mention that their brother had danced. At the moment we paid no attention to this remark, but it came back to our minds now, and we determined that they should dance also. To accomplish this, we used all our arts, and very soon bent them to our wills, so that they could refuse us nothing. At the end of the day we remained possessors of the talismans, and had left them to their fate, while the prince and Thelamis fell more in love with us than ever, and declared that we were more lovely than any women in the world. The sun had set before we quitted the inn, and we had made no plans as to where we should go next, so we readily consented to the prince's proposal that we should embark without delay for the Isle of Black Marble. What a place it was! Rocks, blacker than jet, towered above its shores, and shed thick darkness over the country. Our sailors had not been there before, and were nearly as frightened as ourselves, but thanks to Thelamis, who undertook to be our pilot, we landed safely on the beach. When we had left the coast behind us with its walls of jet, we entered a lovely country where the fields were greener, the streams clearer, the sun brighter than anywhere else. The people crowded round to welcome their prince, whom they loved dearly, but they told him that the king was still full of rage at his son's refusal to marry his cousin, the Princess Okimpar, and also at his flight. Indeed, they all begged him not to visit the capital, as his life would hardly be safe. So much as I should have enjoyed seeing the home of my beloved prince, I implored him to listen to this wise advice, and to let us all go to Thelamis's place in the middle of a vast forest. To my sister and myself, who had been brought up in a cottage, this house of Thelamis's seemed like fairyland. It was built of pink marble, so highly polished that the flowers and streams surrounding it were reflected as in a mirror. One set of rooms was furnished especially for me in yellow silk and silver to suit my black hair. Fresh dresses were provided for us every day, and we had slaves to wait on us. Ah, why could not this happiness have lasted forever? The peace of our lives was troubled by Thelamis's jealousy of my sister, as he could not endure to see her on friendly terms with the prince, though knowing full well that his heart was mine. Every day we had scenes of tender reproaches and of explanations, but Tezila's tears never failed to bring Thelamis to his knees, with prayers for forgiveness. We'd been living in this way for some months, when one day the news came that the king had fallen dangerously ill. I begged the prince to hurry at once to the court, both to see his father and also to show himself to the senators and nobles, but as his love for me was greater than his desire of a crown, he hesitated, as if foreseeing all that afterwards happened. At last Tezila spoke to him so seriously in Thelamis's presence that he determined to go, but promised that he would return before night. Night came, but no prince, and Tezila, who had been the cause of his departure, showed such signs of uneasiness that Thelamis's jealousy was at once awakened. As for me, I cannot tell what I suffered. Not being able to sleep, I arose from my bed and wandered into the forest, along the road which he had taken so many hours before. Suddenly I heard in the distance the sound of a horse's hoofs, and in a few moments the prince had flung himself down and was by my side. "Ah, how I adore you!" he exclaimed. "Thelamis's love will never equal mine." The words were hardly out of his mouth when I heard a slight noise behind, and before we could turn round both our heads were rolling in front of us, while the voice of Thelamis cried, "Perjured wretches, answer me, and you faithless Tezila, tell me why you have betrayed me like this." Then I understood what had happened, and that in his rage he had mistaken me for my sister. "Alas!" replied my head in weak tones, "I am not Tezila but Dely, whose life you have destroyed as well as that of your friend." At this Thelamis paused, and seemed to reflect for an instant. "Be not frightened," he said more quietly, "I can make you whole again." And laying a magic powder on our tongues, he placed our heads on our necks. In the twinkling of an eye, our heads were joined to our bodies without leaving so much as a scar, only that blinded with rage as he still was, Thelamis had placed my head on the prince's body, and his on mine. I cannot describe to you how odd we both felt at this strange transformation. We both instinctively put up our hands, he to feel his hair, which was of course dressed like a woman's, and I to raise the turban, which was pressed heavily on my forehead. But we did not know what had happened to us, for the night was still dark. At this point Tezila appeared, followed by a troop of slaves bearing flowers. It was only by the light of their torches that we understood what had occurred. Indeed, the first thought of both of us was that we must have changed clothes. Now, in spite of what we may say, we all prefer our own bodies to those of anybody else, so notwithstanding our love for each other, at first we could not help feeling a little cross with Thelamis. However, so deep was the prince's passion for me that very soon he began to congratulate himself on the change. "My happiness is perfect," he said. "My heart, beautiful Dely, has always been yours, and now I have your head also." But though the prince made the best of it, Thelamis was much ashamed of his stupidity. "I have," he said hesitatingly, "two other pastilles, which have the same magic properties as those I used before. Let me cut off your heads again, and that will put matters straight." The proposal sounded tempting, but was a little risky, and after consulting together, we decided to let things remain as they were. "Do not blame me, then," continued Thelamis, "if you will not accept my offer. But take the two pastilles, and if it ever happens that you are decapitated a second time, make use of them in the way I have shown you, and each will get back his own head." So saying, he presented us with the pastilles, and we all returned to the castle. However, the troubles caused by the unfortunate exchange were only just beginning. My head, without thinking what it was doing, led the prince's body to my apartments. But my women, only looking at the dress, declared I had mistaken the corridor, and called some slaves to conduct me to his highness's rooms. This was bad enough, but when, as it was still night, my servants began to undress me, I nearly fainted from surprise and confusion, and no doubt the prince's head was suffering in the same manner at the other end of the castle. By the next morning, you will easily guess that we slept but little. We had grown partly accustomed to our strange situation, and when we looked in the mirror, the prince had become brown-skinned and black-haired, while my head was covered with his curly golden locks. And after that first day, everyone in the palace had become so accustomed to the change that they thought no more about it. Some weeks after this, we heard that the king of the Isle of Black Marble was dead. The prince's head, which once was mine, was full of ambitious desires, and he longed to ride straight to the capital and proclaim himself king. But then came the question as to whether the nobles would recognize the prince with a girl's body, and indeed when we came to think of it, which was prince and which was girl? At last, after much argument, my head carried the day, and we set out, but only to find that the king had declared the Princess Okimpare his successor. The greater part of the senators and nobles openly professed that they would much have preferred the rightful heir, but as they could not recognize him either in the prince or me, they chose to consider us as impostors, and threw us into prison. A few days later, Tezila and Thelamis, who had followed us to the capital, came to tell us that the new queen had accused us of high treason, and had herself been present at our trial, which was conducted without us. They had been in mortal terror as to what would be our sentence, but by a piece of extraordinary luck we had been condemned to be beheaded. I told my sister that I did not see exactly where the luck came in, but Thelamis interrupted me rudely. "What!" he cried, "of course I shall make use of the pastilles, and but here the officers arrived to lead us to the great square where the execution was to take place, for Okimpare was determined there should be no delay. The square was crowded with people of all ages and all ranks, and in the middle a platform had been erected on which was the scaffold, with the executioner in a black mask standing by. At a sign from him I mounted first, and in a moment my head was rolling at his feet. With a bound my sister and Thelamis were beside me, and like lightning Thelamis seized the sabre from my headsman, and cut off the head of the prince. And before the multitude had recovered from their astonishment at these strange proceedings, our bodies were joined to our right heads, and the pastilles placed on our tongues. Then Thelamis led the prince to the edge of the platform, and presented him to the people, saying, "Behold your lawful king." Shouts of joy rent the air at the sound of Thelamis's words, and the noise reached Okimpare in the palace. Smitten with despair at the news, she fell down unconscious on her balcony, and was lifted up by the slaves and taken back to her own house. Meanwhile our happiness was all turned to sorrow. I had rushed up to the prince to embrace him fondly, when he suddenly grew pale and staggered. "I die faithful to you," he murmured, turning his eyes toward me, "and I die a king." And leaning his head on my shoulder, he expired quietly, for one of the arteries in his neck had been cut through. Not knowing what I did, I staggered toward the sabre which was lying near me, with the intention of following my beloved prince as speedily as possible. And when Thelamis seized my hand, but only just in time, in my madness I turned the sabre upon him, and he fell, struck through the heart at my feet. The whole company were listening to the story with breathless attention, when it became plain that Dely could go no further, while Tezila had flung herself on a heap of cushions and hidden her face. Zambak ordered her women to give them all the attention possible, and desired that they should be carried into her own rooms. When the two sisters were in this condition, Ibrahim, who was a very prudent young man, suggested to his parents that as the two Circassians were both unconscious, it would be an excellent opportunity to search them and see if the talismans belonging to the daughters of Sirocco were concealed about their persons. But the Bassa, shocked at the notion of treating his guests in so inhospitable a manner, refused to do anything of the kind, adding that the next day he hoped to persuade them to give up the talismans of their own free will. By this time it was nearly midnight, and Yanker, who was standing near the Jewess Sumi, drew out the portrait of Argentine, and heard with delight that she was even more beautiful than her picture. Everyone was waiting on tiptoe for the appearance of the two watches, who were expected when the clock struck 12 to come in search of Sumi, and that there might be no delay the Bassa ordered all the doors to be flung wide open. It was done, and there entered not the longed-for watches, but the page, who had been sent away in disgrace. Then the Bassa arose in wrath. "Azemi," he said, "did I not order you to stand no more in my presence?" "My lord," replied Azemi, modestly, "I was hidden outside the door, listening to the tale of the two Circassians. And as I know you are fond of stories, give me also leave to tell you one. I promise you it shall not be long." "Speak on," replied the Bassa, "but take heed what you say." "My lord," began Azemi, "this morning I was walking in the town when I noticed a man going in the same direction followed by a slave. He entered a baker's shop, where he bought some bread which he gave to the slave to carry. I watched him, and saw that he purchased many other kinds of provisions at other places, and when the slave could carry no more, his master commanded him to return home and have supper ready at midnight. When left alone the man went up the street, and turning into a jeweller's shop brought out a watch that as far as I could see was made of silver. He walked on a few steps, then stooped and picked up a gold watch which lay at his feet. At this point I ran up and told him that if he did not give me half its price I would report him to the Cadi. He agreed, and conducting me to his house produced 400 sequins, which he said was my share, and having got what I wanted I went away. As it was the hour for attending on my lord, I returned home and accompanied you to the Cadi. where I heard the story of the 3 Jews, and learned the importance of the 2 watches I had left at the stranger's. I hastened to his house, but he had gone out, and I could find only the slave, whom I told that I was the bearer of important news for his master. Believing me to be one of his friends, he begged me to wait, and showed me into a room where I saw the 2 watches lying on the table. I put them in my pocket, leaving the 400 sequins in place of the gold watch, and 3 gold pieces, which I knew to be the price of the other. As you know, the watches never remain with the person who buys them. This man may think himself very lucky to get back his money. I've wound them both up, and at this instant Aurora and Argentine are locked safely into my own room." Everybody was so delighted to hear this news that Azemi was nearly stifled with their embraces, and Yangir could hardly be prevented from running to break in the door, though he did not even know where the page slept. But the page begged to have the honour of fetching the ladies himself, and soon returned, leading them by the hand. For some minutes all was a happy confusion, and Ibrahim took advantage of it to fall on his knees before Aurora, and search in the 5th fold of her dress for the missing coral bead. The book of spells had told the truth. There it was, and as the chaplet was now complete, the young man's days of seeking were over. In the midst of the general rejoicing, Hassan alone bore a gloomy face. "Alas," he said, "every one is happy but the miserable being you see before you. I have lost the only consolation in my grief, which was to feel that I had a brother in misfortune." "Be comforted," replied the Bassa. "Sooner or later the dervish who stole the pink bag is sure to be found." Supper was then served, and after they had all eaten of rare fruits, which seemed to them the most delicious in the whole world, the Bassa ordered the flask containing the elixir of love to be brought, and the young people to drink of it. Then their eyes shone with a new fire, and they swore to be true to each other till death. This ceremony was scarcely over when the clock struck 1, and in an instant Aurora and Argentine had vanished, and in the place where they stood lay the 2 watches. Silence fell upon all the company. They had forgotten the enchantment. Then the voice of Azemi was heard, asking if he might be allowed to take charge of the watches till the next day, pledging his head to end their enchantment. With the consent of Sumi, this was granted, and the Bassa gave Azemi a purse containing 1,000 sequins as a reward for the services he had already rendered to them. After this everybody went to his own apartment. Azemi had never possessed so much money before, and never closed his eyes for joy the whole night long. Very early he got up and went into the garden, thinking how he could break the enchantment of the daughters of Sirocco. Suddenly the soft tones of a woman fell on his ear, and peeping through the bushes he saw Tezila, who was arranging flowers in her sister's hair. The rustling of the leaves caused Dely to start. She jumped up as if to fly, but Azemi implored her to remain, and begged her to tell him what happened to them after the death of their lovers, and how they had come to find the dervish. "The punishment decreed to us by the Queen Okimpare," answered Dely, "was that we were to dance and sing in the midst of our sorrow, at a great fete, which was to be held that very day for all her people. This cruel command nearly turned our brains, and we swore a solemn oath to make all lovers as wretched as we were ourselves. In this design we succeeded so well that in a short time the ladies of the capital came in a body to Okimpare and prayed her to banish us from the kingdom, before their lives were made miserable for ever. She consented and commanded us to be placed on board a ship, with our slave, Guluku. On the shore we saw an old man, who was busily engaged in drowning some little black pigs, talking to them all the while as if they could understand him. 'Accursed race!' said he, 'it is you who have caused all the misfortunes of him to whom I gave the magic bracelet. Perish, all of you!' We drew near from curiosity, and recognized in him the dervish who had sheltered us on our first escape from the caravan. When the old man discovered who we were, he was beside himself with pleasure, and offered us a refuge in the cave where he lived. We gladly accepted his offer, and into the cave we all went, taking with us the last little pig, which he gave us as a present. 'The Bassa of the sea,' he said, 'will pay you anything you like to ask for it.' Without asking why it was so precious, I took the pig and placed it in my work bag, where it has been ever since. Only yesterday we offered it to the Bassa, who laughed at us, and this so enraged us against the dervish that we cut off his beard when he was asleep, and now he dare not show himself." "Ah!" exclaimed the page, "it is not fitting that such beauty should waste itself in making other people miserable. Forget the unhappy past, think only of the future, and accept, I pray you, this watch, to mark the brighter hours in store." So saying, he laid the watch upon her knee. Then he turned to Tezila, "And you, fair maiden, permit me to offer you this other watch. True, it is only of silver, but it is all I have left to give, and I feel quite sure that you must have somewhere a silver seal that will be exactly the thing to go with it." "Why, so you have," cried Dely. "Fasten your silver seal to your watch, and I will hang my gold one on to mine." The seals were produced, and, as Azemi had guessed, they were the talismans which the two Circassians had taken from Izif and Azuf, mounted in gold and silver. As quick as lightning, the watches slid from the hands of Tezila and her sister, and Aurora and Argentine stood before them, each with her talisman on her finger. At first they seemed rather confused themselves at the change which had taken place, and the sunlight which they had not seen for so long, but when gradually they understood that their enchantment had come to an end, they could find no words to express their happiness. The Circassians could with difficulty be comforted for the loss of the talismans, but Aurora and Argentine entreated them to dry their tears, as their father, Sirocco, who was governor of Alexandria, would not fail to reward them in any manner they wished. This promise was soon confirmed by Sirocco himself, who came into the garden with the Bassa and his two sons, and was speedily joined by the ladies of the family. Only Hassan was absent. It was the hour in which he was condemned to bewail his ebony hand. To the surprise of all, a noise was at this moment heard in a corner of the terrace, and Hassan himself appeared, surrounded by slaves, clapping his hands and shouting with joy. "I was weeping as usual," cried he, "when all at once the tears refused to come to my eyes, and on looking down at my hand I saw that its blackness had vanished. And now, lovely Zelida, nothing prevents me any longer from offering you the hand when the heart has been yours always." But though Hassan had never thought of asking or caring what had caused this cure, the others were by no means so indifferent. It was quite clear that the little black pig must be dead, but how and when? To this the slaves answered that they had seen that morning a man pursued by 3 others, and that he had taken refuge in the cavern which they had been left to guard. Then in obedience to orders they had rolled a stone over the entrance. Piercing shrieks interrupted their story, and a man, whom the Circassians saw to be the old dervish, rushed round the corner of the terrace with the 3 Jews behind him. When the fugitive beheld so many people collected together, he turned down another path, but the slaves captured all 4 and brought them before their master. What was the surprise of the boss when he beheld in the old dervish the man who had given the chaplet, the copper plaque, and the bracelet to his 3 sons. "Fear nothing, holy father," he said, "you are safe with me, but tell us, how came you here?" "My lord," explained the dervish, "when my beard was cut off during my sleep by the 2 Circassians, I was ashamed to appear before the eyes of men, and fled, bearing with me the pink silk bag. In the night these 3 men fell in with me, and we passed some time in conversation. But at dawn, when it was light enough to see each other's faces, one of them exclaimed that I was the dervish travelling with the 2 Circassians who had stolen the talismans from the Jews. I jumped up and tried to fly to my cave, but they were too quick for me, and just as we reached your garden they snatched the bag, which contained the little black pig, and flung it into the sea. By this act, which delivers your son, I would pray you forgive them for any wrongs they may have done to you, nay more, that you will recompense them for it." The Bassa granted the holy man's request, and seeing that the 2 Jews had fallen victims to the charms of the Circassian ladies, gave his consent to their union, which was fixed to take place at the same time as that of Izaf with the wise Sumi. The Cadi was sent for, and the Jews exchanged the hats of their race for the turbans of the followers of the Prophet. Then, after so many misfortunes, the Bassa's 3 sons entreated their father to delay their happiness no longer, and the 6 marriages were performed by the Cadi at the hour of noon. End of chapter 21. Recording by Amy Hengst.
Chapter 22 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robin. The Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. The Jackal and the Spring. Once upon a time, all the streams and rivers ran so dry that the animals did not know how to get water. After a very long search, which had been quite in vain, they found a tiny spring, which only wanted to be dug deeper so as to yield plenty of water. So the beasts said to each other, "Let us dig a well, and then we shall not fear to die of thirst." And they all consented except the Jackal, who hated work of any kind, and generally got somebody to do it for him. When they had finished their well, they held a council as to who should be made the guardian of the well, so that the Jackal might not come near it, for, they said, he would not work, therefore he shall not drink. After some talk it was decided that the Rabbit should be left in charge. Then all the other beasts went back to their homes. When they were out of sight, the Jackal arrived. Good morning, Rabbit!" And the Rabbit politely said, "Good morning." Then the Jackal unfastened the little bag that hung at his side, and pulled out of it a piece of honeycomb which he began to eat, and turning to the Rabbit he remarked, "As you see, Rabbit, I am not thirsty in the least, and this is nicer than any water." "Give me a bit," asked the Rabbit. So the Jackal handed him a very little morsel. "Oh, how good it is!" cried the Rabbit. "Give me a little more, dear friend." But the Jackal answered, "If you really want me to give you some more, you must have your paws tied behind you and lie on your back, so that I can pour it into your mouth." And the Rabbit did as he was bid, and when he was tied tight and popped on his back, the Jackal ran to the spring and drank as much as he wanted. When he had quite finished he returned to his den. In the evening the animals all came back, and when they saw the Rabbit lying with his paws tied, they said to him, "Rabbit, how did you let yourself be taken in like this?" "It was all the fault of the Jackal," replied the Rabbit. "He tied me up like this, and he told me he would give me something nice to eat. It was all just a trick to get at our water." "Rabbit, you are no better than an idiot to have let the Jackal drink our water when he would not help to find it. Who shall be our next watchman? We must have somebody a little sharper than you." And the little Hare called out, "I will be the watchman." The following morning the animals all went their various ways, leaving the little Hare to guard the spring. When they were out of sight the Jackal came back. Good morning, little Hare!" And the little Hare politely said, "Good morning." "Can you give me a pinch of snuff?" the Jackal said. "I am so sorry, but I have none," answered the little Hare. The Jackal then came and sat down by the Hare, and unfastened his little bag, pulling out of it a piece of honeycomb. He licked his lips and exclaimed, "Oh, little Hare, if only you knew how good it is!" "What is it?" asked the little Hare. "It is something that moistens my throat so deliciously," answered the Jackal, "that after I have eaten it I don't feel thirsty any more, while I am sure that all you other beasts are forever wanting water." "Give me a bit, dear friend?" asked the little Hare. "Not so fast," replied the Jackal. "If you really wish to enjoy what you are eating, you must have your paws tied behind you, and lie on your back so that I can pour it into your mouth." "You can tie them, only be quick," said the little Hare, and when he was tied tight and popped on his back, the Jackal went quietly down the well and drank as much as he wanted. When he had quite finished he returned to his den. In the evening the animals all came back, and when they saw the little Hare with his paws tied, they said to him, "Little Hare, how did you let yourself be taken in like this? Didn't you boast you were very sharp? You undertook to guard our water, now show us how much is left for us to drink." "It is all the fault of the Jackal," replied the little Hare. "He told me he would give me something nice to eat, if I would just let him tie my hands behind my back." Then the little Hare said, "Who can we trust to mount guard now?" And the Panther answered, "Let it be the Tortoise." The following morning the animals all went their various ways, leaving the Tortoise to guard the spring. When they were out of sight the Jackal came back. "Good morning, Tortoise, good morning." But the Tortoise took no notice. "Good morning, Tortoise, good morning." But still the Tortoise pretended not to hear. Then the Jackal said to himself, "Well, today I have only got to manage a bigger idiot than before. I shall just kick him to one side, and then go and have a drink." So he went up to the tortoise and said to him in a soft voice, "Tortoise, tortoise." But the tortoise took no notice. Then the jackal kicked him out of the way, and went to the well and began to drink, but scarcely had he touched the water than the tortoise seized him by the leg. The jackal shrieked out, "Oh, you will break my leg!" But the tortoise only held on tighter. The jackal then took his bag, and tried to make the tortoise smell the honeycomb he had inside, but the tortoise turned his head away and smelt nothing. At last the jackal said to the tortoise, "I should like to give you my bag and everything in it." But the only answer the tortoise made was to grasp the jackal's leg tighter still. So matters stood when the other animals came back. The moment he saw them, the jackal gave a violent tug and managed to free his leg, and then took to his heels as fast as he could. And the animals all said to the tortoise, "Well done, tortoise, you have proved your courage. Now we can drink from our well in peace, as you have got the better of that thieving jackal." End of The Jackal and the Spring. Recording by Robin in Norman, Oklahoma.
Chapter 23 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy Burgoyne. The Grey Fairy Book. Edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 23. The Bear. Once on a time there was a king who had an only daughter. He was so proud and so fond of her that he was in constant terror that something would happen to her if she went outside the palace, and thus, owing to his great love for her, he forced her to lead the life of a prisoner, shut up within her own rooms. The princess did not like this at all, and one day she complained about it very bitterly to her nurse. Now, the nurse was a witch, though the king did not know it. For some time she listened and tried to soothe the princess, but when she saw that she would not be comforted, she said to her: "Your father loves you very dearly, as you know. Whatever you were to ask from him he would give you. The one thing he will not grant you is permission to leave the palace. Now, do as I tell you. Go to your father and ask him to give you a wooden wheelbarrow and a bear's skin. When you have got them, bring them to me, and I will touch them with my magic wand. The wheelbarrow will then move of itself, and will take you at full speed wherever you want to go. And the bear's skin will make such a covering for you that no one will recognize you." So the princess did as the witch advised her. The king, when he heard her strange request, was greatly astonished, and asked her what she meant to do with a wheelbarrow and a bear's skin. And the princess answered: "You never let me leave the house. At least you might grant me this request." So the king granted it, and the princess went back to her nurse, taking the barrow and the bear's skin with her. As soon as the witch saw them, she touched them with her magic wand, and in a moment the barrow began to move about in all directions. The princess next put on the bear's skin, which so completely changed her appearance that no one could have known that she was a girl and not a bear. In this strange attire she seated herself on the barrow, and in a few minutes she found herself far away from the palace, and moving rapidly through a great forest. Here she stopped the barrow with a sign that the witch had shown her, and hid herself and it in a thick grove of flowering shrubs. Now it happened that the prince of that country was hunting with his dogs in the forest. Suddenly he caught sight of the bear hiding among the shrubs, and calling his dogs, hounded them on to attack it. But the girl, seeing what peril she was in, cried: "Call off your dogs, or they will kill me." What harm have I ever done to you?" At these words, coming from a bear, the prince was so startled that for a moment he stood stock still. Then he said quite gently, "Will you come with me? I will take you to my home." "I will come gladly," replied the bear, and seating herself on the barrow it at once began to move in the direction of the princess's palace. You may imagine the surprise of the prince's mother when she saw her son return accompanied by a bear, who at once set about doing the housework better than any servant that the queen had ever seen. Now it happened that there were great festivities going on in the palace of a neighbouring prince, and at dinner one day the prince said to his mother, "This evening there is to be a great ball, to which I must go." And his mother answered, "Go and dance and enjoy yourself." Suddenly a voice came from under the table, where the bear had rolled itself, as it was its wont. "Let me come to the ball. I, too, would like to dance." But the only answer the prince made was to give the bear a kick, and to drive it out of the room. In the evening the prince set off for the ball. As soon as he had started, the bear came to the queen and implored to be allowed to go to the ball, saying that she would hide herself so well that no one would know she was there. The kind hearted queen could not refuse her. Then the bear ran to the barrow, threw off her bear's skin, and touched it with the magic wand that the witch had given her. In a moment the skin was changed into an exquisite ball dress, woven out of moonbeams, and the wheelbarrow was changed into a carriage drawn by two prancing steeds. Stepping into the carriage, the princess drove to the grand entrance of the palace. When she entered the ballroom, in her wondrous dress of moonbeams, she looked so lovely, so different from all the other guests, that everyone wondered who she was, and no one could tell where she had come from. From the moment he saw her, the prince fell desperately in love with her, and all the evening he would dance with no one else but the beautiful stranger. When the ball was over, the princess drove away in her carriage at full speed, for she wished to get home in time to change her ball dress into the bear's skin, and the carriage into the wheelbarrow, before any one discovered who she was. The prince, putting spurs into his horse, rode after her, for he was determined not to let her out of his sight. But suddenly a thick mist arose and hid her from him. When he reached his home, he could talk to his mother of nothing else but the beautiful stranger with whom he had danced so often, and with whom he was so much in love. And the bear beneath the table smiled to itself, and muttered, "I am the beautiful stranger. Oh, how I have taken you in!" The next evening there was a second ball, and, as you may believe, the prince was determined not to miss it, for he thought he would once more see the lovely girl, and dance with her and talk to her, and make her talk to him, for at the first ball she had never opened her lips. And, sure enough, as the music struck up the first dance, the beautiful stranger entered the room, looking even more radiant than the night before, for this time her dress was woven out of the rays of the sun. All evening the prince danced with her, but she never spoke a word. When the ball was over, he tried once more to follow her carriage, that he might know whence she came, but suddenly a great waterspout fell from the sky, and the blinding sheets of rain hid her from his sight. When he reached his home he told his mother that he had again seen the lovely girl, and that this time she had been even more beautiful than the night before. And again the bear smiled beneath the table, and muttered, I have taken him in a second time, and he has no idea that I am the beautiful girl with whom he is so much in love." On the next evening the Prince returned to the palace for the third ball, and the Princess went too, and this time she had changed her bear's skin into a dress woven out of starlight, studded all over with gems, and she looked so dazzling and so beautiful that everyone wondered at her, and said that no one so beautiful had ever been seen before. And the Prince danced with her, and though he could not induce her to speak, he succeeded in slipping a ring on her finger. When the ball was over he followed her carriage, and rode at such a pace that for long he kept it in sight. Then suddenly a terrible wind arose between him and the carriage, and he could not overtake it. When he reached his home he said to his mother, "I do not know what is to become of me. I think I shall go mad. I am so much in love with that girl, and I have no means of finding out who she is. I danced with her and I gave her a ring, and yet I do not know her name, nor where I am to find her." Then the bear laughed beneath the table and muttered to itself. And the Prince continued, "I am tired to death. Order some soup to be made for me, but I don't want that bear to meddle with it. Every time I speak of my love, the brute mutters and laughs, and seems to mock at me. I hate the sight of the creature." When the soup was ready, the bear brought it to the Prince, but before handing it to him, she dropped into the plate the ring the Prince had given her the night before at the ball. The Prince began to eat his soup very slowly and languidly, for he was sad at heart, and all his thoughts were busy, wondering how and where he could see the lovely stranger again. Suddenly he noticed the ring at the bottom of the plate. In a moment he recognized it, and was dumb with surprise. Then he saw the bear standing beside him, looking at him with gentle, beseeching eyes, and something in the eyes of the bear made him say, "Take off that skin, some mystery is hidden beneath it." And the bear's skin dropped off, and the beautiful girl stood before him, in the dress woven out of the starlight, and he saw that she was the stranger with whom he had fallen so deeply in love. And now she appeared to him 1,000 times more beautiful than ever, and he led her to his mother. And the Princess told them her story, and how she had been kept shut up by her father in his palace, and how she had wearied of her imprisonment. And the Prince's mother loved her, and rejoiced that her son should have so good and beautiful a wife. So they were married, and lived happily for many years, and reigned wisely over their kingdom. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy Burgoyne. The Grey Fairy Book. Edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 24. The Sun-Child. Once there was a woman who had no children, and this made her very unhappy. So she spoke one day to the Sunball, saying, "Dear Sunball, send me only a little girl now, and when she is 12 years old you may take her back again." So soon after this the Sunball sent her a little girl, whom the woman called Letiko, and watched over with great care till she was 12 years old. Soon after that, while Letiko was away one day gathering herbs, the Sunball came to her and said, "Letiko, when you go home, tell your mother that she must bethink herself of what she promised me. Then Letiko went straight home, and said to her mother, "While I was gathering herbs a fine tall gentleman came to me and charged me to tell you that you should remember what you promised him." When the woman heard that, she was sore afraid, and immediately shut all the doors and windows of the house, stopped up all the chinks and holes, and kept Letiko hidden away, that the Sunball should not come and take her away. But she forgot to close up the keyhole, and through it the Sunball sent a ray into the house, which took hold of the little girl and carried her away to him. One day, the Sunball having sent her to the straw shed to fetch straw, the girl sat down on the piles of straw and bemoaned herself, saying, "As sighs this straw under my feet, so sighs my heart after my mother." And this caused her to be so long away that the Sunball asked her, when she came back, "Eh, Letiko, where have you been so long?" She answered, "My slippers are too big, and I could not go faster." Then the Sunball made the slippers shorter. Another time he sent her to fetch water, and when she came to the spring, she sat down and lamented, saying, "As flows the water, even so flows my heart, with longing for my mother." Thus she again remained so long away that the Sunball asked her, "Eh, Letiko, where have you remained so long away?" And she answered, "My petticoat is too long and hinders me in walking." Then the Sunball cut her petticoat to make it shorter. Another time the Sunball sent her to bring him a pair of sandals, and as the girl carried these in her hand she began to lament, saying, "As creaks the leather so creaks my heart after my little mother." When she came home the Sunball asked her again, "Eh, Letiko, why do you come home so late?" "My red hood is too wide, and falls over my eyes, therefore I could not go fast." Then he made the hood narrower. At last, however, the Sunball became aware how sad Letiko was. He sent her a second time to bring straw, and, slipping in after her, he heard how she lamented for her mother. Then he went home, called two foxes to him, and said, "Will you take Letiko home?" "Yes, why not?" "But what will you eat and drink if you should become hungry and thirsty by the way?" "We will eat her flesh and drink her blood." When the Sunball heard that, he said, "You are not suited for this affair." Then he sent them away and called two hares to him, and said, "Will you take Letiko home to her mother?" "Yes, why not?" "What will you eat and drink if you should become hungry and thirsty by the way?" "We will eat grass and drink from streamlets." "Then take her and bring her home." Then the hares set out, taking Letiko with them, and because it was a long way to her home, they became hungry by the way. Then they said to the little girl, "Climb this tree, dear Letiko, and remain there till we have finished eating." So Letiko climbed the tree, and the hares went grazing. It was not very long, however, before a lamia came under the tree and called out, "Letiko, Letiko, come down and see what beautiful shoes I have on." "Oh, my shoes are much finer than yours." "Come down, I am in a hurry, for my house is not yet swept." "Go home and sweep it then, and come back when you are ready." Then the lamia went away and swept her house. When she was ready she came back and called out, "Letiko, Letiko, come down and see what a beautiful apron I have." "Oh, my apron is much finer than yours." "If you will not come down, I will cut down the tree and eat you." "Do so, and then eat me." Then the lamia hewed with all her strength at the tree, but could not cut it down, and when she saw that, she called out, "Letiko, Letiko, come down, for I must feed my children." "Go home then, and feed them, and come back when you are ready." When the lamia was gone away, Letiko called out, "Little hares, little hares." Then said one hare to the other, "Listen, Letiko is calling," and they both ran back to her as fast as they could go. Then Letiko came down from the tree, and they went on their way. The lamia ran as fast as she could after them, to catch them up, and when she came to a field where people were working she asked them, "Have you seen anyone pass this way?" They answered, "We are planting beans." "Oh, I did not ask about that, but if anyone had passed this way." But the people only answered the louder, "Are you deaf? It is beans, beans, beans we are planting." When Letiko had nearly reached her home, the dog knew her, and called out, "Bow wow! See, here comes Letiko." And the mother said, "Hush, thou beast of ill omen! Wilt thou make me burst with misery?" Next the cat on the roof saw her, and called out, "Meow, meow! See, here comes Letiko." And the mother said, "Keep silence, thou beast of ill omen! Wilt thou make me burst with misery?" Then the cock spied, and called out, "Cock a doodle doo! See, here comes Letiko." And the mother said again, "Be quiet, thou bird of ill omen! Wilt thou make me burst with misery?" The nearer Letiko and the two hares came to the house, the nearer also came the lamia, and when the hare was about to slip in by the house door, she caught it by its little tail and tore it out. When the hare came in, the mother stood up and said to it, "Welcome, dear little hare, because you have brought me back Letiko. I will silver your little tail." And she did so, and lived ever after with her daughter in happiness and content. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 25. The Daughter of Buk Ettemsuch. Once upon a time there lived a man who had 7 daughters. For a long time they dwelt quite happily at home. Then one morning the father called them all before him and said, "Your mother and I are going on a journey, and as we do not know how long we may be away, you will find enough provisions in the house to last you 3 years. But see you do not open the door to any one till we come home again."
"Very well, dear father," replied the girls. For 2 years they never left the house or unlocked the door. But one day, when they had washed their clothes and were spreading them out on the roof to dry, the girls looked down into the street where people were walking to and fro, and across to the market with its stalls of fresh meat, vegetables, and other nice things. "Come here," cried one. "It makes me quite hungry. Why should we not have our share? Let one of us go to the market and buy meat and vegetables." "Oh, we mustn't do that," said the youngest. "You know our father forbade us to open the door until he came home again." Then the eldest sister sprang at her and struck her, the second spit at her, the third abused her, the fourth pushed her, the fifth flung her to the ground, and the sixth tore her clothes. Then they left her lying there on the floor, and went out with a basket. In about an hour they came back with the basket full of meat and vegetables, which they put in a pot and set on the fire, quite forgetting that the house door stood wide open. The youngest sister, however, took no part in all this, and when dinner was ready and the table laid, she stole softly out to the entrance hall, and hid herself behind a great cask which stood in one corner. Now, while the other sisters were enjoying their feast, a witch passed by, and catching sight of the open door, she walked in.
She went up to the eldest girl and said, "Where shall I begin on you, you fat bolster?" "You must begin," answered she, "with the hand which struck my little sister." So the witch gobbled her up, and when the last scrap had disappeared she came to the second and asked, "Where shall I begin on you, my fat bolster?" And the second answered, "You must begin on my mouth, which spat on my sister." And so on to the rest, and very soon the whole six had disappeared, and as the witch was eating the last mouthful of the last sister, the youngest, who had been crouching, frozen with horror, behind the barrel, ran out through the open door into the street. Without looking behind her she hastened on as fast as her feet would carry her, till she saw an ogre's castle standing in front of her. In a corner near the door she spied a large pot, and she crept softly up to it, and pulled the cover over it, and went to sleep. By and by the ogre came home.
"Fee, fo, fum," cried he, "I smell the smell of a man. What ill fate has brought him here?"
And he looked through all the rooms and found nobody.
"Where are you?" he called. "Do not be afraid. I will do you no harm."
But the girl was still silent.
"Come out, I tell you," repeated the ogre. "Your life is quite safe. If you are an old man, you shall be my father. If you are a boy, you shall be my son. If your years are as many as mine, you shall be my brother. If you are an old woman, you shall be my mother. If you are a young one, you shall be my daughter. If you are middle-aged, you shall be my wife. So come out, and fear nothing."
Then the maiden came out of her hiding-place and stood before him.
"Fear nothing,"
said the ogre again, and when he went away to hunt he left her to look after the house. In the evening he returned, bringing with him hares, partridges, and gazelles for the girl's supper. For himself, he only cared for the flesh of men, which she cooked for him. He also gave into her charge the keys of 6 rooms, but the key of the 7th he kept himself. And time passed on, and the girl and the ogre still lived together. She called him father, and he called her daughter, and never once did he speak roughly to her. One day the maiden said to him, "Father, give me the key of the upper chamber."
"No, my daughter," replied the ogre. "There is nothing there that is any use to you."
"But I want the key," she repeated again. However, the ogre took no notice, and pretended not to hear. The girl began to cry, and said to herself, "To-night, when he thinks I'm asleep, I will watch and see where he hides it." And after she and the ogre had supped, she bade him good night and left the room. In a few minutes she stole quietly back and watched from behind a curtain. In a little while she saw the ogre take the key from his pocket and hide it in a hole in the ground before he went to bed. And when all was still she took out the key and went back to the house. The next morning the ogre awoke with the first ray of light, and the first thing he did was to look for the key. It was gone, and he guessed at once what had become of it. But instead of getting into a great rage, as most ogres would have done, he said to himself,
"If I wake the maiden up, I shall only frighten her. For to-day she shall keep the key, and when I return to-night it will be time enough to take it from her."
So he went off to hunt. The moment he was safe out of the way, the girl ran upstairs and opened the door of the room, which was quite bare. The one window was closed, and she threw back the lattice and looked out. Beneath lay a garden which belonged to the Prince, and in the garden was an ox, who was drawing up water from the well all by himself, for there was nobody to be seen anywhere. The ox raised his head at the noise the girl made in opening the lattice, and said to her, "Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch. Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you." These words so frightened the maiden that she burst into tears and ran out of the room. All day she wept, and when the ogre came home at night no supper was ready for him.
"What are you crying for?" said he. "Where is my supper? And is it you who have opened the upper chamber?"
"Yes, I opened it," answered she.
And what did the ox say to you?"
"He said, 'Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch. Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you.'"
"Well, tomorrow you can go to the window and say, 'My father is feeding me up till I am nice and fat, but he does not mean to eat me. If I had one of your eyes I would use it for a mirror, and look at myself before and behind, and your girths should be loosened, and you should be blind, 7 days and 7 nights.'"
"All right," replied the girl, and the next morning when the ox spoke to her, she answered him as she had been told, and he fell down straight upon the ground, and lay there 7 days and 7 nights. But the flowers in the garden withered, for there was no one to water them. When the Prince came into his garden he found nothing but yellow stalks. In the midst of them the ox was lying. With a blow from his sword he killed the animal, and turning to his attendants he said, "Go and fetch another ox." And they brought in a great beast, and he drew the water out of the well, and the flowers revived, and the grass grew green again. Then the Prince called his attendants and went away. The next morning the girl heard the noise of the water wheel, and she opened the lattice and looked out of the window. "Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch," said the new ox. "Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you." And the maiden answered, "My father is feeding me up till I am nice and fat, but he does not mean to eat me. If I had one of your eyes I would use it for a mirror, and look at myself before and behind, and your girths should be loosened, and you should be blind 7 days and 7 nights." Directly she uttered those words the ox fell to the ground and lay there 7 days and 7 nights. Then he arose and began to draw the water from the well. He had only turned the wheel once or twice when the Prince took it into his head to visit his garden and see how the new ox was getting on. When he entered the ox was working busily, but in spite of that the flowers and grass were dried up. And the Prince drew his sword and rushed at the ox to slay him as he had done the other. But the ox fell on his knees and said, "My lord, only spare my life, and let me tell you how it happened." "How what happened?" asked the Prince. "My lord, a girl looked out of that window and spoke a few words to me, and I fell to the ground. For 7 days and 7 nights I lay there, unable to move. But, oh, my lord, it is not given to us twice to behold beauty such as hers." "It is a lie," said the Prince. "An ogre dwells there. Is it likely that he keeps a maiden in his upper chamber?" "Why not?" replied the ox. "But if you come here at dawn tomorrow and hide behind that tree, you will see for yourself." "So I will," said the Prince, "and if I find that you have not spoken truth I will kill you." The Prince left the garden, and the ox went on with his work. Next morning the Prince came early to the garden and found the ox busy with the water wheel. "Has the girl appeared yet?" he asked. "Not yet, but she will not be long. Hide yourself in the branches of that tree, and you will soon see her." The Prince did as he was told, and scarcely was he seated when the maiden threw open the lattice. "Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch," said the ox. "Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you." "My father is feeding me up till I am nice and fat, but he does not mean to eat me. If I had one of your eyes I would use it for a mirror, and look at myself before and behind, and your girths should be loosened, and you should be blind 7 days and 7 nights." And hardly had she spoken when the ox fell on the ground, and the maiden shut the lattice and went away. But the Prince knew that what the ox had said was true, and that she had not her equal in the whole world. And he came down from the tree, his heart burning with love. "Why has the ogre not eaten her?" thought he. "This night I will invite him to supper in my palace, and question him about the maiden, and find out if she is his wife." So the Prince ordered a great ox to be slain and roasted whole, and 2 huge tanks to be made, one filled with water and the other with wine. And towards evening he called his attendants, and went to the ogre's house to wait in the courtyard till he came back from hunting. The ogre was surprised to see so many people assembled in front of his house, but he bowed politely and said,
"Good morning, dear neighbours. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? I have not offended you, I hope."
"Oh, certainly not," answered the Prince.
"Then," continued the ogre, "what has brought you to my house today for the first time?"
"We should like to have supper with you," said the Prince.
"Well, supper is ready, and you are welcome," replied the ogre, leading the way into the house,
for he had had a good day, and there was plenty of game in the bag over his shoulder. A table was quickly prepared, and the Prince had already taken his place, when he suddenly exclaimed, "After all, Buk Ettemsuch, suppose you come to supper with me?"
"Where?"
asked the Ogre. "In my house. I know it's all ready."
"But it is so far off. Why not stay here?"
"Oh, I will come another day, but this evening I must be your host." So the Ogre accompanied the Prince and his attendants back to the palace. After a while the Prince turned to the Ogre and said, "It is as a wooer that I appear before you. I seek a wife from an honourable family."
"But I have no daughter," replied the Ogre.
"Oh, yes, you have. I saw her at the window."
"Well, you can marry her if you wish."
So the Prince's heart was glad as he and his attendants rode back with the Ogre to his house. And as they parted, the Prince said to his guest, "You will not forget the bargain we have made?"
"I am not a young man, and I never break my promises," said the Ogre, and went in and shut the door. Upstairs he found the maiden, waiting till he returned to have her supper, for she did not like eating by herself. "I have had my supper," said the Ogre, "for I have been spending the evening with the Prince."
"Where did you meet him?" asked the girl.
"Oh, we are neighbours, and grew up together, and tonight I promised that you should be his wife."
"I don't want to be any man's wife," answered she, but this was only pretence, for her heart too was glad. Next morning early came the Prince, bringing with him bridal gifts and splendid wedding garments to carry the maiden back to his palace. But before he let her go the Ogre called her to him, and said,
"Be careful, girl, never to speak to the Prince, and when he speaks to you, you must be dumb, unless he swears by the head of Buk Ettemsuch. Then you may speak."
"Very well," answered the girl. They set out, and when they reached the palace the Prince led his bride to the room he had prepared for her, and said, "Speak to me, my wife." But she was silent, and by he left her, thinking that perhaps she was shy. The next day the same thing happened, and the next. At last he said, "Well, if you won't speak, I shall go and get another wife who will." And he did. And when the new wife was brought to the palace, the daughter of Buk Ettemsuch rose, and spoke to the ladies who had come to attend on the second bride. "Go and sit down. I will make ready the feast." And the ladies sat down as they were told, and waited. The maiden sat down too, and called out, "Come here, firewood," and the firewood came. "Come here, fire," and the fire came and kindled the wood. "Come here, pot," "Come here, oil," and the pot and the oil came. "Get into the pot, oil," said she, and the oil did it. When the oil was boiling, the maiden dipped all her fingers in it, and they became 10 fried fishes. "Come here, oven," she cried next, and the oven came. "Fire, heat the oven," and the fire heated it. When it was hot enough, the maiden jumped in, just as she was, with her beautiful silver and gold dress, and all her jewels. In a minute or two she had turned into a snow-white loaf that made your mouth water. Said the loaf to the ladies, "You can eat now. Do not stand so far off." But they only stared at each other, speechless with surprise. "What are you staring at?" asked the new bride. "At all these wonders," replied the ladies. "Do you call these wonders?" said she scornfully. "I can do that too," and she jumped straight into the oven, and was burnt up in a moment. Then they ran to the Prince and said, "Come quickly, your wife is dead." "Bury her then," returned he. "But why did she do it? I am sure I said nothing to make her throw herself into the oven." Accordingly the burnt woman was buried, but the Prince would not go to the funeral, as all his thoughts were still with the wife who would not speak to him. The next night he said to her, "Dear wife, are you afraid that something dreadful will happen if you speak to me? If you still persist in being dumb, I shall be forced to get another wife." The poor girl longed to speak, but dread of the Ogre kept her silent, and the Prince did as he had said, and brought a fresh bride into the palace. And when she and her ladies were seated in state, the maiden planted a sharp stake in the ground, and sat herself down comfortably upon it, and began to spin. "What are you staring at so?" said the new bride to her ladies. "Do you think that is anything wonderful? Why, I can do as much myself." "I'm sure you can't," said they, much too surprised to be polite. Then the maid sprang off the stake and left the room, and instantly the new wife took her place, but the sharp stake ran through, and she was dead in a moment. So they sent to the Prince and said, "Come quickly and bury your wife." "Bury her yourselves," he answered. "What did she do it for? It was not by my orders that she impaled herself on the stake." So they buried her, and in the evening the Prince came to the daughter of Buk Ettemsuch and said to her, "Speak to me, or I shall have to take another wife." But she was afraid to speak to him. The following day the Prince hid himself in the room and watched, and soon the maiden woke and said to the pitcher and to the water jug, "Quick, go down to the spring and bring me some water. I am thirsty." And they went, but as they were filling themselves at the spring, the water jug knocked against the pitcher and broke off its spout, and the pitcher burst into tears and ran to the maiden and said, "Mistress, beat the water jug, for he has broken my spout." "By the head of Buk Ettemsuch, I implore you not to beat me." "Ah," she replied, "if only my husband had sworn by that oath, I could have spoken to him from the beginning, and he need never have taken another wife. But now he will never say it, and he will have to go on marrying fresh ones." And the Prince, from his hiding place, heard her words, and he jumped up and ran to her and said, "By the head of Buk Ettemsuch, speak to me." So she spoke to him, and they lived happily to the end of their days, because the girl kept the promise she had made to the ogre. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 26, Laughing Eye and Weeping Eye, or The Limping Fox. Servian Story. Once upon a time there lived a man whose right eye always smiled, and whose left eye always cried. And this man had 3 sons, 2 of them very clever, and the third very stupid. Now these 3 sons were very curious about the peculiarity of their father's eyes, and as they could not puzzle out the reason for themselves, they determined to ask their father why he did not have eyes like other people. So the eldest of the 3 went one day into his father's room and put the question straight out. But instead of answering, the man flew into a fearful rage, and sprang at him with a knife. The young fellow ran away in a terrible fright, and took refuge with his brothers, who were awaiting anxiously the result of the interview. "You had better go yourselves," was all the reply they got, "and see if you will fare any better." Upon hearing this, the second son entered his father's room, only to be treated in the same manner as his brother, and back he came, telling the youngest, the fool of the family, that it was his turn to try his luck. Then the youngest son marched boldly up to his father and said to him, "My brothers would not let me know what answer you had given to their question. But now do tell me why your right eye always laughs and your left eye always weeps." As before, the father grew purple with fury and rushed forwards with his knife. But the simpleton did not stir a step. He knew that he had really nothing to fear from his father. "Ah, now I see who is my true son," exclaimed the old man. "The others are mere cowards, and as you have shown me that you are brave, I will satisfy your curiosity. My right eye laughs because I am glad to have a son like you. My left eye weeps because a precious treasure has been stolen from me. I had in my garden a vine that yielded a ton of wine every hour. Someone has managed to steal it, so I weep its loss." The simpleton returned to his brothers and told them of their father's loss, and they all made up their minds to set out at once in search of the vine. They travelled together till they came to some crossroads, and there they parted, the 2 elder ones taking one road, and the simpleton the other. "Thank goodness we have got rid of that idiot!" exclaimed the 2 elder. "Now let us have some breakfast." And they sat down by the roadside and began to eat. They had only half finished when a lame fox came out of a wood and begged them to give him something to eat. But they jumped up and chased him off with their sticks, and the poor fox limped away on his 3 pads. As he ran, he reached the spot where the youngest son was getting out the food he had brought with him, and the fox asked him for a crust of bread. The simpleton had not very much for himself, but he gladly gave half of his meal to the hungry fox. "Where are you going, brother?" said the fox, when he had finished his share of the bread, and the young man told him the story of his father and the wonderful vine. "Dear me, how lucky!" said the fox. "I know what has become of it. Follow me." So they went on till they came to the gate of a large garden. You will find here the vine that you are seeking, but it will not be at all easy to get it. You must listen carefully to what I am going to say. Before you reach the vine, you will have to pass 12 outposts, each consisting of 2 guards. If you see these guards looking straight at you, go on without fear, for they are asleep. But if their eyes are shut, then beware, for they are wide awake. If you once get to the vine, you will find 2 shovels, one of wood and the other of iron. Be sure not to take the iron one. It will make a noise and rouse the guards, and then you are lost. The young man got safely through the garden without any adventures till he came to the vine which yielded a ton of wine an hour. But he thought he should find it impossible to dig the hard earth with only a wooden shovel, so picked up the iron one instead. The noise it made soon awakened the guards. They seized the poor simpleton and carried him to their master. "Why do you steal my vine?" demanded he. "And how did you manage to get past the guards?" "The vine is not yours, it belongs to my father, and if you will not give it to me now, I will return and get it somehow." "You shall have the vine if you will bring me in exchange an apple off the golden apple tree that flowers every 24 hours and bears fruit of gold." So saying, he gave orders that the simpleton should be released, and this done, the youth hurried off to consult the fox. "Now you see," observed the fox, "this comes of not following my advice. However, I will help you get the golden apple. It grows in a garden that you will easily recognize from my description. Near the apple tree are 2 poles, one of gold, the other of wood. Take the wooden pole, and you will be able to reach the apple." Master Simpleton listened carefully to all that was told him, and after crossing the garden and escaping as before from the men who were watching it, soon arrived at the apple tree. But he was so dazzled by the sight of the beautiful golden fruit that he quite forgot all that the fox had said. He seized the golden pole and struck the branch a sounding blow. The guards at once awoke and conducted him to their master. Then the simpleton had to tell his story. "I will give you the golden apple," said the owner of the garden, "if you will bring me in exchange a horse which can go round the world in 24 hours." And the young man departed and went to find the fox. This time the fox was really angry, and no wonder. "If you had listened to me, you would have been home with your father by this time. However, I am willing to help you once more. Go into the forest, and you will find the horse with 2 halters round his neck. One is of gold, the other of hemp. Lead him by the hempen halter, or else the horse will begin to neigh and will waken the guards. Then all is over with you." So Master Simpleton searched till he found the horse, and was struck dumb at its beauty. "What!" he said to himself, "put the hempen halter on an animal like that? Not I, indeed." Then the horse neighed loudly. The guards seized our young friend and conducted him before their master. "I will give you the golden horse," said he, "if you will bring me in exchange a golden maiden who has never yet seen either sun or moon." "But if I am to bring you the golden maiden, you must lend me first the golden steed with which to seek her." "Ah," replied the owner of the golden horse, "but who will undertake that you will ever come back?" "I swear on the head of my father," answered the young man, "that I will bring back either the maiden or the horse." And he went away to consult the fox. Now the fox, who was always patient and charitable to other people's faults, led him to the entrance of a deep grotto, where stood a maiden all of gold and beautiful as the day. He placed her on his horse and prepared to mount. "Are you not sorry," said the fox, "to give such a lovely maiden in exchange for a horse? Yet you are bound to do it, for you have sworn by the head of your father. But perhaps I could manage to take her place." So saying, the fox transformed himself into another golden maiden, so like the first that hardly anyone could tell the difference between them. The simpleton took her straight to the owner of the horse, who was enchanted with her. And the young man got back his father's vine and married the real golden maiden into the bargain. Conte populaire slave, traduit par Louis Léger, Paris, Ernest Leroux et d'études. End of chapter 26. Recording by ALWPOE on February 5th, 2011. ALWPOE.com.
Chapter 27 of the Gray Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 27. A long time ago there lived a king and queen who had no children, although they both wished very much for a little son. They tried not to let each other see how unhappy they were, and pretended to take pleasure in hunting and hawking and all sorts of other sports. But at length the king could bear it no longer, and declared that he must go and visit the furthest corners of his kingdom, and that it would be many months before he should return to his capital. By that time he hoped he would have so many things to think about that he would have forgotten to trouble about the little son who never came. The country the king reigned over was very large, and full of high, stony mountains and sandy deserts, so that it was not at all easy to go from one place to another. One day the king had wandered out alone, meaning to go only a little distance, but everything looked so alike he could not make out the path by which he had come. He walked on and on for hours, the sun beating hotly on his head, and his legs trembling under him, and he might have died of thirst if he had not suddenly stumbled on a little well, which looked as if it had been newly dug. On the surface floated a silver cup with a golden handle, but as it bobbed about, whenever the king tried to seize it, he was too thirsty to wait any longer, and knelt down and drank his fill. When he had finished, he began to rise from his knees, but somehow his beard seemed to have stuck fast in the water, and with all his efforts he could not pull it out. After 2 or 3 jerks to his head, which only hurt him without doing any good, he called out angrily, "Let go at once! Who is holding me?" "It is I, the King Kostiei," said a voice from the well, and looking up through the water was a little man with green eyes and a big head. "You have drunk from my spring, and I shall not let you go until you promise to give me the most precious thing your palace contains, which was not there when you left it." Now the only thing that the king much cared for in his palace was the queen herself, and as she was weeping bitterly on a pile of cushions in the great hall when he had ridden away, he knew that Kostiei's words could not apply to her. So he cheerfully gave the promise asked for by the ugly little man, and in the twinkling of an eye, man, spring, and cup had disappeared, and the king was left kneeling on the dry sand, wondering if it all was a dream. But as he felt much stronger and better, he made up his mind that this strange adventure must really have happened, and he sprang on his horse and rode off with a light heart to look for his companions. In a few weeks they began to set out on their return home, which they reached one hot day, 8 months after they had all left. The king was greatly beloved by his people, and crowds lined the road, shouting and waving their hats as the procession passed along. On the steps of the palace stood the queen, with a splendid golden cushion in her arms, and on the cushion the most beautiful boy that ever was seen, wrapped about in a cloud of lace. In a moment Kostiei's words rushed into the king's mind, and he began to weep bitterly, to the surprise of everybody who had expected him nearly to die of joy at the sight of his son. But try as he would, and work as hard as he might, he could never forget his promise, and every time he let the baby out of his sight he thought that he had seen it for the last time. However, years passed on, and the prince grew first into a big boy, and then into a fine young man. Kostiei made no sign, and gradually even the anxious king thought less and less about him, and in the end forgot him altogether. There was no family in the whole kingdom happier than the king and queen and prince, until one day when the youth met a little old man as he was hunting in a lonely part of the woods. "How are you, my unlooked-for prince?" he said. "You kept them waiting a good long time." "And who are you?" asked the prince. "You will know soon enough. When you go home, give my compliments to your father, and tell him that I wish he would square accounts with me. If he neglects to pay his debts, he will bitterly repent it." So saying, the old man disappeared, and the prince returned to the palace and told his father what had happened. The king turned pale and explained to his son the terrible story. "Do not grieve over it, father," answered the prince. "It is nothing so dreadful after all. I will find some way to force Kostiei to give up his rights over me. But if I do not come back in a year's time, you must give up all hopes of ever seeing me." Then the prince began to prepare for his journey. His father gave him a complete suit of steel armor, a sword, and a horse, while his mother hung round his neck a cross of gold. So, kissing him tenderly, with many tears, they let him go. He rode steadily on for 3 days, and at sunset on the 4th day he found himself on the seashore. On the sand before him lay 12 white dresses, dazzling as the snow. Yet as far as his eyes could reach there was no one in sight to whom they could belong. Curious to see what would happen, he took up one of the garments, and leaving his horse loose to wander about the adjoining fields, he hid himself among some willows and waited. In a few minutes a flock of geese which had been paddling about in the sea approached the shore and put on the dresses, struck the sand with their feet, and were transformed in the twinkling of an eye into 11 beautiful young girls, who flew away as fast as they could. The 12th and youngest remained in the water, stretching out her long white neck and looking about her anxiously. Suddenly among the willows she perceived the king's son, and called out to him with a human voice, "O prince, give me back my dress, and I shall be forever grateful to you." The prince hastened to lay the dress on the sand and walked away. When the maiden had thrown off the goose skin and quickly put on her proper clothes, she came towards him, and he saw that none had ever seen or told of such a beauty as hers. She blushed and held out her hand, saying to him in a soft voice, "I thank you, noble prince, for having granted my request. I am the youngest daughter of Kostiei the Immortal, who has 12 daughters and rules over the kingdoms under the earth. Long time my father has waited for you, and great is his anger. But trouble not yourself and fear nothing, only do as I bid you. When you see the king Kostiei, fall straightway upon your knees and heed neither his threats nor his cry, but draw near to him boldly. That which will happen after you will know in time. Now let us go." At these words she struck the ground with her foot, and a gulf opened, down which they went right into the heart of the earth. In a short time they reached Kostiei's palace, which gives light, with a light brighter than the sun, to the dark kingdoms below. And the prince, as he had been bidden, entered boldly into the hall. Kostiei, with a shining crown upon his head, sat in the center upon a golden throne. His green eyes glittered like glass. His hands were as the claws of a crab. When he caught sight of the prince, he uttered piercing yells which shook the walls of the palace. The prince took no notice, but continued his advance on his knees toward the throne. When he had almost reached it, the king broke out into a laugh and said, "It has been very lucky for you that you have been able to make me laugh. Stay with us in our underground empire, only first you will have to do 3 things. Tonight it is late. Go to sleep. Tomorrow I will tell you." Early the following morning the prince received a message that Kostiei was ready to see him. He got up and dressed, and hastened to the presence chamber, where the little king was seated on his throne. When the prince appeared, bowing low before him, Kostiei began, "Now, prince, this is what you have to do. By tonight you must build me a marble palace, with windows of crystal and a roof of gold. It is to stand in the middle of a great park, full of streams and lakes. If you are able to build it, you shall be my friend. If not, off with your head." The prince listened in silence to this startling speech, and then returning to his room, set himself to think about the certain death that awaited him. He was quite absorbed in these thoughts when suddenly a bee flew against the window and tapped, saying, "Let me come in." He rose and opened the window, and there stood before him the youngest princess. "What are you dreaming about, Prince?" "I was dreaming of your father, who has planned my death." "Fear nothing. You may sleep in peace, and tomorrow morning, when you awake, you will find the palace all ready." What she said, she did. The next morning, when the prince left his room, he saw before him a palace more beautiful than his fancy had ever pictured. Kostiei, for his part, could hardly believe his eyes, and pondered deeply how it got there. "Well, this time you have certainly won, but you're not going to be let off so easily. Tomorrow all my 12 daughters shall stand in a row before you, and if you cannot tell me which of them is the youngest, off goes your head." "What? Not recognize the youngest princess?" said the prince to himself as he entered his room. "A likely story." "It is such a difficult matter that you will never be able to do it without my help," replied the bee, who was buzzing about the ceiling. "We are all so exactly alike that even our father scarcely knows the difference between us." "Then what must I do?" "This. The youngest is she who will have a ladybird on her eyelid. Be very careful. Now goodbye." Next morning King Kostiei again sent for the prince. The young princesses were all drawn up in a row, dressed precisely in the same manner, and with their eyes all cast down. As the prince looked at them, he was amazed at their likeness. Twice he walked along the line without being able to detect the sign agreed upon. The third time his heart beat fast at the sight of a tiny speck upon the eyelid of one of the girls. "This one is the youngest," he said. "How in the world did you guess?" cried Kostiei in a fury. "There is some jugglery about this. But you are not going to escape me so easily. In 3 hours you shall come here and give me another proof of your cleverness. I shall set alight a handful of straw, and before it is burnt up you will have turned it into a pair of boots. If not, off goes your head." So the prince returned sadly into his room, but the bee was there before him. "Why do you look so melancholy, my handsome prince?" "How can I help looking melancholy when your father has ordered me to make him a pair of boots? Does he take me for a shoemaker?" "What do you think of doing?" "Not of making boots, at any rate. I am not afraid of death. One can only die once after all." "No, Prince, you shall not die. I will try to save you, and we will fly together or die together." As she spoke she spat upon the ground, and then, drawing the prince after her out of the room, she locked the door behind her and threw away the key. Holding each other tight by the hand, they made their way up into the sunlight and found themselves by the side of the same sea, while the prince's horse was still quietly feeding in the neighbouring meadow. The moment he saw his master, the horse whinnied and galloped towards him. Without losing an instant, the prince sprang into the saddle, swung the princess behind him, and away they went like an arrow from a bow. When the hour arrived which Kostiei had fixed for the prince's last trial, and there were no signs of him, the king sent to his room to ask why he delayed so long. The servants, finding the door locked, knocked loudly and received for answer, "In one moment." It was the spittle, which was imitating the voice of the prince. The answer was taken back to Kostiei. He waited. Still no prince. He sent the servants back again, and the same voice replied, "Immediately." "He's making fun of me," shrieked Kostiei in a rage. "Break in the door and bring him to me." The servants hurried to do his bidding. The door was broken open. Nobody inside, but just the spittle in fits of laughter. Kostiei was beside himself with rage and commanded his guards to ride after the fugitives. If the guards returned without the fugitives, their heads should pay for it. By this time the prince and princess had got a good start and were feeling quite happy, when suddenly they heard the sound of a gallop far behind them. The prince sprang from the saddle and laid his ear to the ground. "They are pursuing us," he said. "Then there is no time to be lost," answered the princess, and as she spoke she changed herself into a river, the prince into a bridge, the horse into a crow, and divided the wide road beyond the bridge into 3 little ones. When the soldiers came up to the bridge, they paused uncertainly. How were they to know which of the 3 roads the fugitives had taken? They gave it up in despair and returned trembling to Kostiei. "Idiots!" he exclaimed in a passion. "They were the bridge and the river, of course! Do you mean to say you never thought of that? Go back at once!" And off they galloped like lightning. But time had been lost, and the prince and the princess were far on their way. "I hear a horse," cried the princess. The prince jumped down and laid his ear to the ground. "Yes," he said, "they are not far off now." In an instant prince, princess, and horse had all disappeared, and instead was a dense forest, crossed and recrossed by countless paths. Kostiei's soldiers dashed hastily into the forest, believing they saw before them the flying horse with its double burden. They seemed close upon them when suddenly horse, wood, everything disappeared, and they found themselves at the place where they started. There was nothing for it but to return to Kostiei and tell him of this fresh disaster. "A horse! A horse!" cried the king. "I will go after them myself. This time they shall not escape." And he galloped off, foaming with anger. "I think I hear someone pursuing us," said the princess. "Yes, so do I. And this time it is Kostiei himself, but his power only reaches as far as the first church, and he can go no farther. Give me your golden cross." So the prince unfastened the cross, which was his mother's gift, and the princess hastily changed herself into a church, the prince into a priest, and the horse into a belfry. It was hardly done when Kostiei came up. "Greeting, monk. Have you seen some travelers on horseback pass this way?" "Yes, the prince and Kostiei's daughter have just gone by. They have entered the church and told me to give you their greetings if I met you." Then Kostiei knew that he had been hopelessly beaten, and the prince and princess continued their journey without any more adventures. End of chapter 27. Recording by Lynn Handler.
Chapter 28 of The Gray Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elliot Miller. The Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. The Simpleton. There lived once upon a time a man who was as rich as he could be. But as no happiness in this world is ever quite complete, he had an only son who was such a simpleton that he could barely add 2 and 2 together. At last his father determined to put up with his stupidity no longer, and giving him a purse full of gold, he sent him off to seek his fortune in foreign lands, mindful of the adage, "How much a fool's that's sent to roam excels a fool that stays at home." Massillon, for this was the youth's name, mounted a horse and set out for Venice, hoping to find a ship there that would take him to Cairo. After he had ridden for some time, he saw a man standing at the foot of a poplar tree, and said to him, "What's your name, my friend? Where do you come from, and what can you do?" The man replied, "My name is Quick as Thought. I come from Fleet Town, and I can run like lightning." "I should like to see you," returned Massillon. "Just wait a minute, then," said Quick as Thought, "and I will soon show you that I am speaking the truth." The words were hardly out of his mouth when a young doe ran right across the field they were standing in. Quick as Thought let her run on a short distance in order to give her a start, and then pursued her so quickly and so lightly that you could not have tracked his footsteps if the field had been strewn with flour. In a very few springs he had overtaken the doe, and had so impressed Massillon with his fleetness of foot that he begged Quick as Thought to go with him, promising at the same time to reward him handsomely. Quick as Thought agreed to his proposal, and they continued on their journey together. They had hardly gone a mile when they met a young man, and Massillon stopped and asked him, "What's your name, my friend? Where do you come from, and what can you do?" The man thus addressed answered promptly, "I am called Hare's Ear. I come from Curiosity Valley, and if I lay my ear on the ground, without moving from the spot, I can hear everything that goes on in the world, the plots and intrigues of court and cottage, and all the plans of mice and men.' 'If that's the case,' replied Moscione, 'just tell me what's going on in my own home at present.' The youth laid his ear to the ground, and at once reported, 'An old man is saying to his wife, "Heaven be praised that we have got rid of Moscione, for perhaps, when he has been out in the world a little, he may gain some common sense, and return home less a fool than when he set out."' 'Enough, enough!' cried Moscione. 'You speak the truth, and I believe you. Come with us, and your fortune's made.' The young man consented, and after they had gone about 10 miles, they met a third man, to whom Moscione said, 'What's your name, my brave fellow? Where were you born, and what can you do?' The man replied, 'I am called Hit the Point. I come from the city of Perfect Aim, and I draw my bow so exactly that I can shoot a pea off a stone.' 'I should like to see you do it, if you've no objection,' said Moscione. The man at once placed a pea on a stone, and drawing his bow, he shot it in the middle with the greatest possible ease. When Moscione saw that he had spoken the truth, he immediately asked Hit the Point to join his party. After they had all travelled together for some days, they came upon a number of people who were digging a trench in the blazing sun. Moscione felt so sorry for them that he said, 'My dear friends, how can you endure working so hard in heat that would cook an egg in a minute?' But one of the workmen answered, 'We are fresh as daisies, for we have a young man among us who blows on our backs like the west wind.' 'Let me see him,' said Moscione. The youth was called, and Moscione asked him, 'What's your name? Where do you come from, and what can you do?' He answered, 'I am called Blowblast. I come from Wind Town, and with my mouth I can make any winds you please. If you wish a west wind, I can raise it for you in a second. But if you prefer a north wind, I can blow these houses down before your eyes.' 'Seeing is believing,' returned the cautious Moscione. Blowblast at once began to convince him of the truth of his assertion. First he blew so softly that it seemed like the gentle breeze at evening, and then he turned around and raised such a mighty storm that he blew down a whole row of oak trees. When Moscione saw this he was delighted, and begged Blowblast to join his company, and as they went on their way they met another man, whom Moscione addressed as usual. 'What's your name? Where do you come from, and what can you do?' 'I am called Strongback. I come from Powerborough, and I possess such strength that I can take a mountain on my back, and it seems a feather to me.' 'If that's the case,' said Moscione, 'you are a clever fellow, but I should like some proof of your strength.' Then Strongback loaded himself with great boulders of rock and trunks of trees, so that 100 wagons could not have taken away all that he carried on his back. When Moscione saw this he prevailed on Strongback to join his group, and they all continued their journey till they came to a country called Flower Vale. Here there reigned a king whose only daughter ran as quickly as the wind, and so lightly that she could run over a field of young oats without bending a single blade. The king had given out a proclamation that anyone who could beat the princess in a race should have her for a wife, but that all who failed in the competition should lose their head. As soon as Moscione heard of the royal proclamation, he hastened to the king and challenged the princess to race with him. But on the morning appointed for the trial he sent word to the king that he was not feeling well, and that as he could not run himself he would supply someone to take his place. 'It's just the same to me,' said Cannetella the princess. 'Let anyone come forward that likes. I am quite prepared to meet him.' At the time appointed for the race the whole place was crowded with people anxious to see the contest, and, punctual to the moment, Quick as Thought and Cannetella, dressed in a short skirt and very lightly shod, appeared at the starting point. Then a silver trumpet sounded, and the two rivals started on their race, looking for all the world like a greyhound chasing a hare. But Quick as Thought, true to his name, outran the princess, and when the goal was reached the people all clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the stranger!" Cannetella was much depressed by her defeat, but as the race had to be run a second time she determined she would not be beaten again. Accordingly she went home and sent Quick as Thought a magic ring, which prevented the person who wore it not only from running, but even from walking, and begged that he would wear it for her sake. Early next morning the crowd assembled on the race course, and Cannetella and Quick as Thought began their trial afresh. The princess ran quickly as ever, but poor Quick as Thought was like an overloaded donkey, and could not go a step. Then Hit the Point, who had heard all about the princess's deception from Hare's ear when he saw the danger his friend was in, seized his bow and arrow and shot the stone out of the ring Quick as Thought was wearing. In a moment the youth's legs became free again, and in 5 bounds he had overtaken Cannetella and won the race. The king was much disgusted when he saw that he must acknowledge Moscione as his future son-in-law, and summoned the wise men of his court to ask if there was no way out of the difficulty. The council at once decided that Cannetella was far too dainty a morsel for the mouth of such a travelling tinker, and advised the king to offer Moscione a present of gold, which no doubt a beggar like him would prefer to all the wives in the world. The king was delighted at this suggestion, and calling Moscione before him, he asked him what sum of money he would take instead of his promised bride. Moscione first consulted with his friends, and then answered, "I demand as much gold and precious stones as my followers can carry away." The king thought he was being let off very easily, and produced coffers of gold, sacks of silver, and chests of precious stones. But the more Strongback was loaded with the treasure, the straighter he stood. At last the treasury was quite exhausted, and the king had to send his courtiers to the subjects to collect all the gold and silver they possessed. But nothing was of any avail, and Strongback only asked for more. When the king's councillors saw the unexpected result of their advice, they said it would be more than foolish to let some strolling thieves take so much treasure out of the country, and urged the king to send a troop of soldiers after them, to recover the gold and precious stones. So the king sent a body of armed men on foot and horse to take back the treasure Strongback was carrying away with him. But Hare's ear, who had heard what the councillors had advised the king, told his companions just as the dust of their pursuers was visible on the horizon. No sooner had Blowblast taken in their danger than he raised such a mighty wind that all the king's army was blown down like so many ninepins, and as they were quite unable to get up again, Moscione and his companions proceeded on their way without further let or hindrance. As soon as they reached his home, Moscione divided the spoil with his companions, at which they were much delighted. He himself stayed with his father, who was obliged at last to acknowledge that his son was not quite such a fool as he looked. From the Italian, Kletki. End of The Simpleton. Recording by Elliot Miller. www.voiceofe.com. Chapter 29 of The Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elliot Miller. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. The Street Musicians. A man once possessed a donkey which had served him faithfully for many years, but at last the poor beast grew old and feeble, and every day his work became more of a burden. As he was no longer of any use, his master made up his mind to shoot him, but when the donkey learnt the fate that was in store for him, he determined not to die, but to run away to the nearest town and there to become a street musician. When he had trotted along for some distance, he came upon a greyhound lying on the road, and panting for dear life. "Well, brother," said the donkey, "what's the matter with you? You look rather tired." So I am, replied the dog, but because I am getting old and am growing weaker every day, and cannot go out hunting any longer, my master wanted to poison me, and, as life is still sweet, I have taken leave of him. But how am I to earn my own livelihood? I haven't a notion. Well, said the donkey, I am on my way to the nearest big town, where I mean to become a street musician. Why don't you take up music as a profession and come along with me? I'll play the flute and you can play the kettle drum. The greyhound was quite pleased at the idea, and the two set off together. When they had gone a short distance they met a cat with a face as long as 3 rainy days. Now, what has happened to upset your happiness, friend Puss? inquired the donkey. It's impossible to look cheerful when one feels depressed, answered the cat. I am well up in years now, and have lost most of my teeth. Consequently, I prefer sitting in front of the fire to catching mice, and so my old mistress wanted to drown me. I have no wish to die yet, so I ran away from her. But good advice is expensive, and I don't know where I am to go to, or what I am to do. Come to the nearest big town with us, said the donkey, and try your fortune as a street musician. I know what sweet music you make at night, so you are sure to be a success. The cat was delighted with the donkey's proposal, and they all continued their journey together. In a short time they came to the courtyard of an inn, where they found a cock crowing lustily. What in the world is the matter with you? asked the donkey. The noise you are making is enough to break the drums of our ears. I am only prophesying good weather, said the cock, for tomorrow is a feast day, and just because it is a holiday and a number of people are expected at the inn, the landlady has given orders for my neck to be wrung tonight, so that I may be made into soup for tomorrow's dinner. I'll tell you what, Redcap, said the donkey, you had much better come with us to the nearest town. You have got a good voice and could join a street band we are getting up. The cock was much pleased with the idea, and the party proceeded on their way. But the nearest big town was a long way off, and it took them more than a day to reach it. In the evening they came to a wood, and they made up their minds to go no further, but to spend the night there. The donkey and the greyhound lay down under a big tree, and the cat and the cock got up into the branches, the cock flying right up to the topmost twig, where he thought he would be safe from all danger. Before he went to sleep he looked round the 4 points of the compass, and saw a little spark burning in the distance. He called out to his companions that he was sure there must be a house not far off, for he could see a light shining. When he heard this the donkey said at once, Then we must get up and go look for the house, for this is very poor shelter. And the greyhound added, Yes, I feel I'd be all the better for a few bones and a scrap or two of meat. So they set out for the spot where the light was to be seen shining faintly in the distance. But the nearer they approached it, the brighter it grew, till at last they came to a brilliantly lighted house. The donkey, being the biggest of the party, went to the window and looked in. Well, Greyhead, what do you see? asked the cock. I see a well-covered table, replied the donkey, with excellent food and drink, and several robbers are sitting round it, enjoying themselves highly. I wish we were doing the same, said the cock. So do I, answered the donkey. Can't we think of some plan for turning out the robbers and taking possession of the house ourselves? So they consulted together what they were to do, and at last they arranged that the donkey should stand at the window with his 4 feet on the sill, that the greyhound should get on his back, the cat on the dog's shoulder, and the cock on the cat's head. When they had grouped themselves in this way, at a given signal, they all began their different forms of music. The donkey brayed, the greyhound barked, the cat meowed, and the cock crew. Then they all scrambled through the window into the room, breaking the glass into 1,000 pieces as they did so. The robbers were all startled by the dreadful noise, and thinking that some evil spirits at the least were entering the house, they rushed out into the wood, their hair standing on end with terror. The four companions, delighted with the success of their trick, sat down at the table and ate and drank all the food and wine that the robbers had left behind them. When they had finished their meal they put out the lights, and each animal chose a suitable sleeping place. The donkey lay down in the courtyard outside the house, the dog behind the door, the cat in front of the fire, and the cock flew up on to a high shelf, and as they were all tired after their long day, they soon went to sleep. Shortly after midnight, when the robbers saw that no light was burning in the house, and that all seemed quiet, the captain of the band said, "We were fools to let ourselves be so easily frightened away," and turning to one of his men he ordered him to go and see if all was safe. The man found everything in silence and darkness, and, going into the kitchen, he thought he had better strike a light. He took a match, and mistaking the fiery eyes of the cat for two glowing coals, he tried to light his match with them. But the cat didn't see the joke, and sprang up at his face, spitting and scratching him in the most vigorous manner. The man was terrified out of his life, and tried to run out by the back door, but he stumbled over the greyhound, which bit him in the leg. Yelling with pain, he ran across the courtyard, only to receive a kick from the donkey's hind leg as he passed him. In the meantime the cock had been roused from his slumbers, and feeling very cheerful he called out from the shelf where he was perched, "Kickery-urky!" Then the robber hastened back to his captain and said, "Sir, there is a dreadful witch in the house who spat at me and scratched at my face with her long fingers, and before the door there stands a man with a long knife who cut my leg severely. In the courtyard outside lies a black monster who fell upon me with a huge wooden club. And that is not all, for sitting on the roof is a judge who called out, 'Bring the rascal to me!' So I fled for dear life." After this the robbers dared not venture into the house again, and they abandoned it for ever. But the four street musicians were so delighted with their lodgings that they determined to take up their abode in the robber's house, and, for all I know to the contrary, they may be living there to this day. From the German Kletke. End of The Street Musicians. Recording by Elliot Miller. www.voiceofe.com.
Chapter 30 of The Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pete Williams. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. The Twin Brothers. Once there was a fisherman who had plenty of money but no children. One day an old woman came to his wife and said, "What use is all your prosperity to you when you have no children?" "It is God's will," answered the fisherman's wife. "Nay, child, it is not God's will, but the fault of your husband, for if he would but catch the little gold fish you would surely have children. Tonight, when he comes home, tell him he must go back and catch the little fish. He must then cut it in 6 pieces. One of these you must eat, and your husband the second, and soon after you will have 2 children. The 3rd piece you must give to the dog, and she will have 2 puppies. The 4th piece give to the mare, and she will have 2 foals. The 5th piece bury on the right of the house door, and the 6th on the left, and 2 cypress trees will spring up there." When the fisherman came home at evening, his wife told him all that the old woman had advised, and he promised to bring home the little gold fish. Next morning, therefore, he went very early to the water, and caught the little fish. Then they did as the old woman had ordered, and in due time the fisherman's wife had 2 sons, so like each other that no one could tell the difference. The dog had 2 puppies exactly alike, the mare had 2 foals, and on each side of the front door there sprang up 2 cypress trees precisely similar. When the 2 boys were grown up, they were not content to remain at home, though they had wealth in plenty, but they wished to go out into the world and make a name for themselves. Their father would not allow them both to go at once, as they were the only children he had. He said, "First one shall travel, and when he is come back, then the other may go." So the one took his horse and his dog and went, saying to his brother, "So long as the cypress trees are green, that is a sign that I am alive and well. But if one begins to wither, then make haste and come to me." So he went forth into the world. One day he stopped at the house of an old woman, and as at evening he sat before the door, he perceived in front of him a castle standing on a hill. He asked the old woman to whom it belonged, and her answer was, "My son, it is the castle of the fairest in the land, and I am come here to woo her." "That, my son, many have sought to do, and have lost their lives in the attempt, for she has cut off their heads and stuck them on the post you see standing there. And the same will she do to me, or else I shall be victor, for tomorrow I go there to court her." Then he took his zither, and played upon it so beautifully that no one in all that land had ever heard the like, and the princess herself came to the window to listen. The next morning the fairest in the land sent for the old woman and asked her, "Who is that lives with you, and plays the zither so well?" "It is a stranger, princess, who arrived yesterday evening," answered the old woman. And the princess then commanded that the stranger should be brought to her. When he appeared before the princess, she questioned him about his home and his family, and about this and that, and confessed at length that his zither playing gave her great pleasure, and that she would take him for her husband. The stranger replied that it was with that intent he had come. The princess then said, "You must now go to my father, and tell him you desire to have me to wife, and when he has put the 3 problems before you, then come back and tell me." The stranger then went straight to the king, and told him that he wished to wed his daughter. And the king answered, "I shall be well pleased, provided you can do what I impose upon you. If not, you will lose your head. Now listen, out there on the ground there lies a thick log, which measures more than 2 fathoms. If you can cleave it in 2 with one stroke of your sword, I will give you my daughter to wife. If you fail, then it will cost you your head." Then the stranger withdrew, and returned to the house of the old woman, sore distressed, for he could believe nothing but that next day he must atone to the king with his head. And so full was he of the idea of how to set about cleaving the log, that he forgot even his zither. In the evening came the princess to the window to listen to his playing, and behold, all was still. Then she called to him, "Why are you so cast down this evening, that you do not play on your zither?" And he told her his trouble. But she laughed at it, and called to him, "And you grieve over that? Bring quickly your zither, and play something for my amusement, and early tomorrow come to me." Then the stranger took his zither, and played the whole evening for the amusement of the princess. Next morning she took a hair from her locks, and gave it to him, saying, "Take this hair, and wind it round your sword. Then you will be able to cleave the log in 2. Then the stranger went forth, and with one blow cleft the log in 2. But the king said, "I will impose another task upon you, before you can wed my daughter." "Speak on," said the stranger. "Listen then," answered the king. "You must mount a horse, and ride 3 miles at full gallop, holding in each hand a goblet full of water. If you spill no drop, then I shall give you my daughter to wife. But should you not succeed, then I will take your life." Then the stranger returned to the house of the old woman, and again he was so troubled as to forget his zither. In the evening the princess came to the window as before, to listen to the music, but again all was still, and she called to him, "What is the matter, that you do not play on your zither?" Then he related all that the king had ordered him to do, and the princess answered, "Do not let yourself be disturbed. Only play now, and come to me tomorrow morning." Then next morning he went to her, and she gave him her ring, saying, "Throw this ring into the water, and it will immediately freeze, so that you will not spill any." The stranger did as the princess bade him, and carried the water all the way. Then the king said, "Now I will give you a third task, and this shall be the last. I have a Negro who will fight with you tomorrow, and if you are the conqueror, you shall wed my daughter." The stranger returned, full of joy, to the house of the old woman, and that evening was so merry that the princess called to him, "You seem very cheerful this evening. What has my father told you that makes you so glad?" He answered, "Your father has told me that tomorrow I must fight with his Negro. He is only another man like myself, and I hope to subdue him and to gain the contest." But the princess answered, "This is the hardest of all. I myself am the black man, for I swallow a drink that changes me into a Negro of unconquerable strength. Go tomorrow morning to the market, buy 12 buffalo hides, and wrap them around your horse. Fasten this cloth round you, and when I am let loose upon you tomorrow, show it to me, that I may hold myself back, and may not kill you. Then, when you fight me, you must try to hit my horse between the eyes, for when you have killed it, you have conquered me." Next morning, therefore, he went to the market, and bought the 12 buffalo hides, which he wrapped round his horse. Then he began to fight with the black man, and when the combat had already lasted a long time, and 11 hides were torn, then the stranger hit the Negro's horse between the eyes, so that it fell dead, and the black man was defeated. Then said the king, "Because you have solved the 3 problems, I take you for my son-in-law." But the stranger answered, "I have some business to conclude first. In 14 days I will return, and bring the bride home." So he arose, and went into another country, where he came to a great town, and alighted at the house of an old woman. When he had had supper, he begged of her some water to drink, but she answered, "My son, I have no water. A giant has taken possession of the spring, and only lets us draw from it once a year, when we bring him a maiden. He eats her up, and then he lets us draw water. Just now it is the lot of the king's daughter, and tomorrow she will be led forth." The next day, accordingly, the princess was led forth to the spring, and bound there with a golden chain. After that all the people went away, and she was left alone. When they had gone, the stranger went to the maiden and asked her what ailed her that she lamented so much, and she answered that the reason was because the giant would come and eat her up, and the stranger promised that he would set her free if she would take him for her husband, and the princess joyfully consented. When the giant appeared, the stranger set his dog at him, and it took him by the throat and throttled him till he died. So the princess was set free. Now when the king heard of it, he gladly consented to the marriage, and the wedding took place with great rejoicings. The young bridegroom abode in the palace 101 weeks. Then he began to find it too dull, and he desired to go out hunting. The king would fain have prevented it, but in this he could not succeed. Then he begged his son-in-law at least to take sufficient escort with him. But this, too, the young man evaded, and took only his horse and his dog. He had ridden already a long way, when he saw in the distance a hut, and rode straight towards it in order to get some water to drink. There he found an old woman from whom he begged the water. She answered that first he should allow her to beat his dog with her little wand, that it might not bite her while she fetched the water. The hunter consented, and as soon as she had touched the dog with her wand, it immediately turned to stone. Thereupon she touched the hunter and also his horse, and both turned to stone. As soon as that had happened, the cypress trees in front of his father's house began to wither. And when the other brother saw this, he immediately set out in search of his twin. He came first to the town where his brother had slain the giant, and there fate led him to the same old woman where his brother had lodged. When she saw him, she took him for his twin brother, and said to him, "Do not take it amiss of me, my son, that I did not come to wish you joy on your marriage with the king's daughter." The stranger perceived what mistake she had made, but only said, "That does not matter, old woman," and rode on, without further speech, to the king's palace, where the king and the princess both took him for his twin brother, and called out, "Why have you tarried so long away? We thought something evil had befallen you." When night came, and he slept with the princess, who still believed him to be her husband, he laid his sword between them, and when morning came he rose early and went out to hunt. Fate led him by the same way which his brother had taken, and from a distance he saw him, and knew that he was turned to stone. Then he entered the hut, and ordered the old woman to disenchant his brother. But she answered, "Let me first touch your dog with my wand, and then I will free your brother." He ordered the dog, however, to take hold of her, and bite her up to the knee, till she cried out, "Tell your dog to let me go, and I will set your brother free." But he only answered, "Tell me the magic words, that I may disenchant him myself." And she would not. He ordered his dog to bite her up to the hip. Then the old woman cried out, "I have 2 wands. With the green one I turn to stone, and with the red one I bring to life again." So the hunter took the red wand and disenchanted his brother, also his brother's horse and his dog, and ordered his own dog to eat the old woman up altogether. While the brothers went on their way back to the castle of the king, the one brother related to the other how the cypress tree had all at once dried up and withered, how he had immediately set out in search of his twin, and how he had come to the castle of his father-in-law, and had claimed the princess as his wife. But the other brother became furious on hearing this, and smote him over the forehead till he died, and returned alone to the house of his father-in-law. When night came, and he was in bed, the princess asked him, "What was the matter with you last night, that you never spoke a word to me?" Then he cried out, "That was not me, but my brother, and I have slain him, because he told me by the way that he had claimed you for his wife." "Do you know the place where you slew him?" asked the princess, "and can you find the body?" "I know the place exactly." "Then tomorrow we shall ride thither," said the princess. Next morning, accordingly, they set out together, and when they had come to the place, the princess drew forth a small bottle that she had brought with her, and sprinkled the body with some drops of the water, so that immediately he became alive again. When he stood up, his brother said to him, "Forgive me, dear brother, that I slew you in my anger." Then they embraced, and went together to the fairest in the land, whom the unmarried brother took to wife. Then the brothers brought their parents to live with them, and all dwelt together in joy and happiness. End of chapter 30. Recording by Pete Williams, Pittsburgh, PA.
Chapter 31 of The Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elliot Miller. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Canetella. There was once upon a time a king who reigned over a country called Buelo Puojo. He was very rich and powerful, and had everything in the world he could desire except a child. But at last, after he had been married for many years, and was quite an old man, his wife Renzolla presented him with a fine daughter, whom they called Canetella. She grew up into a beautiful girl, and was as tall and straight as a young fir tree. When she was 18 years old her father called her to him and said, "You are of an age now, my daughter, to marry and settle down, but as I love you more than anything else in the world, and desire nothing but your happiness, I am determined to leave the choice of a husband to yourself. Choose a man after your own heart, and you are sure to satisfy me." Canetella thanked her father very much for his kindness and consideration, but told him that she had not the slightest wish to marry, and was quite determined to remain single. The king, who felt himself growing old and feeble, and longed to see an heir to the throne before he died, was very unhappy at her words, and begged her earnestly not to disappoint him. When Canetella saw that the king had set his heart on her marriage, she said, "Very well, dear father, I will marry to please you, for I do not wish to appear ungrateful for all your love and kindness. But you must find me a husband handsomer, cleverer, and more charming than anyone else in the world." The king was overjoyed by her words, and from early in the morning till late at night he sat at the window and looked carefully at all the passers by, in the hopes of finding a son-in-law among them. One day, seeing a very good-looking man crossing the street, the king called his daughter and said, "Come quickly, dear Canetella, and look at this man, for I think he might suit you as a husband." They called the young man into the palace, and set a sumptuous feast before him, with every sort of delicacy you can imagine. In the middle of the meal the youth let an almond fall out of his mouth, which, however, he picked up again very quickly, and hid under the tablecloth. When the feast was over the stranger went away, and the king asked Canetella, "Well, what did you think of the youth?" "I think he was a clumsy wretch," replied Canetella. "Fancy a man of his age letting an almond fall out of his mouth." When the king heard her answer he returned to his watch at the window, and shortly afterwards a very handsome young man passed by. The king instantly called his daughter to come and see what she thought of the newcomer. "Call him in," said Canetella, "that we may see him close." Another splendid feast was prepared, and when the stranger had eaten and drunk as much as he was able, and had taken his departure, the king asked Canetella how she liked him. "Not at all," replied his daughter. "What could you do with a man who requires at least 2 servants to help him on with his cloak, because he is too awkward to put it on properly himself?" "If that's all you have against him," said the king, "I see how the land lies. You are determined not to have a husband at all, but marry someone you shall, for I do not mean my name and house to die out." "Well, then, my dear parent," said Canetella, "I must tell you at once that you had better not count upon me, for I never mean to marry unless I can find a man with a gold head and gold teeth." The king was very angry at finding his daughter so obstinate, but, as he always gave the girl her own way in everything, he issued a proclamation to the effect that any man with a gold head and gold teeth might come forward and claim the princess as his bride, and the kingdom of Bello Puojo as a wedding gift. Now the king had a deadly enemy called Scioravante, who was a very powerful magician. No sooner had this man heard of the proclamation than he summoned his attendant spirits and commanded them to gild his head and teeth. The spirits said at first that the task was beyond their powers, and suggested that a pair of golden horns attached to his forehead would both be easier to make and more comfortable to wear, but Scioravante would allow no compromise, and insisted on having a head and teeth made of the finest gold. When it was fixed on his shoulders he went for a stroll in front of the palace, and the king, seeing the very man he was in search of, called his daughter and said, Just look out of the window, and you will find exactly what you want.' Then, as Cervantes was hurrying past, the king shouted out to him, 'Just stop a minute, brother, and don't be in such a desperate haste. If you will step in here you shall have my daughter for a wife, and I will send attendants with her, and as many horses and servants as you wish.' '1,000 thanks,' returned Cervantes. 'I shall be delighted to marry your daughter, but it is quite unnecessary to send anyone to accompany her. Give me a horse, and I will carry off the princess in front of my saddle, and I will bring her to my own kingdom, where there is no lack of courtiers or servants, or indeed of anything your daughter can desire.' At first the king was very much against Cantinella departing in this fashion, but finally Cervantes got his way, and placing the princess before him on his horse, he set out for his own country. Towards evening he dismounted, and entering a stable he placed Cannetella in the same stall as his horse, and said to her, 'Now listen to what I have to say. I am going to my home now, and that is a 7 years' journey from here. You must wait for me in this stable, and never move from this spot, or let yourself be seen by a living soul. If you disobey my commands, it will be the worse for you.' The princess answered meekly, 'Sir, I am your servant, and will do exactly as you bid me, but I should like to know what I am to live on till you come back.' 'You can take what the horses leave,' was Cervantes' reply. When the magician had left her, Cannetella felt very miserable, and bitterly cursed the day she was born. She spent all her time weeping and bemoaning the cruel fate that had driven her from a palace into a stable, from soft down cushions to a bed of straw, and from the dainties of her father's table to the food that the horses left. She led this wretched life for a few months, and during that time she never saw who fed and watered the horses, for it was all done by invisible hands. One day, when she was more than usually unhappy, she perceived a little crack in the wall, through which she could see a beautiful garden, with all manner of delicious fruits and flowers growing in it. The sight and smell of such delicacies were too much for poor Cannetella, and she said to herself, 'I will slip quietly out, and pick a few oranges and grapes, and I don't care what happens. Who is there to tell my husband what I do? And even if he should hear of my disobedience, he cannot make my life more miserable than it is already.' So she slipped out and refreshed her poor starved body with the fruit she plucked in the garden. But a short time afterwards her husband returned unexpectedly, and one of the horses instantly told him that Cannetella had gone into the garden, in his absence, and had stolen some oranges and grapes. Cervantes was furious when he heard this, and seizing a huge knife from his pocket, he threatened to kill his wife for her disobedience. But Cannetella threw herself at his feet and implored him to spare her life, saying that hunger drove even the wolf from the wood. At last she succeeded in so far softening her husband's heart that he said, 'I will forgive you this time and spare your life, but if you disobey me again, and I hear on my return that you have as much as moved out of the stall, I will certainly kill you. So beware, for I am going away once more, and shall be absent for 7 years.' With these words he took his departure, and Cannetella burst into a flood of tears, and wringing her hands she moaned, 'Why was I ever born to such a hard fate? Oh, father, how miserable you have made your poor daughter! But why should I blame my father, for I have only myself to thank for all my suffering. I got the cursed head of gold, and it has brought all this misery on me. I am indeed punished for not doing as my father wished.' When a year had gone by it chanced one day that the king's cooper passed the stables where Cannetella was kept prisoner. She recognised the man and called him to come in. At first he did not know the poor princess, and could not make out who it was that called him by name, but when he heard Cannetella's tale of woe he hid her in a big empty barrel she had with him, partly because he was sorry for the poor girl, and even more because he wished to gain the king's favour. Then he slung the barrel on a mule's back, and in this way the princess was carried to her own home. They arrived at the palace about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the cooper knocked loudly at the door. When the servants came in haste and saw only the cooper standing at the gate, they were very indignant, and scolded him soundly for coming at such an hour and waking them all out of their sleep. The king, hearing the noise and the cause of it, sent for the cooper, for he felt certain that the man must have some important business to have come and disturbed the whole palace at such an early hour. The cooper asked permission to unload his mule, and Cannetella crept out of the barrel. At first the king refused to believe that it was really his daughter, for she had changed so terribly in a few years, and had grown so thin and pale that it was pitiful to see her. At last the princess showed her father a mole that she had on her right arm, and then he saw that the poor girl was indeed his long lost Cannetella. He kissed her 1,000 times, and instantly had the choicest food and drink set before her. After she had satisfied her hunger, the king said to her, "Who would have thought, my dear daughter, to have found you in such a state? What, may I ask, has brought you to this pass?" Cannetella replied, "That wicked man with the gold head and teeth treated me worse than a dog, and many a time since I left you have I longed to die. But I couldn't tell you all that I have suffered, for you would never believe me. It is enough that I am once more with you, and I shall never leave you again, for I would rather be a slave in your house than a queen in any other." In the meantime Scioravante had returned to the stables, and one of the horses told him that Cannetella had been taken away by a cooper in a barrel. When the wicked magician heard this he was beside himself with rage, and hastening to the kingdom of Bellopujo, he went straight to an old woman who lived exactly opposite the royal palace, and said to her, "If you will let me see the king's daughter, I will give you whatever reward you like to ask for." The woman demanded 100 ducats of gold, and Scioravante counted them out of his purse and gave them to her without a murmur. Then the old woman led him to the roof of the house, where he could see Cannetella combing out her long hair in a room in the top story of the palace. The princess happened to look out of the window, and when she saw her husband gazing at her she got such a fright that she flew downstairs to the king, and said, "My lord and father, unless you shut me up instantly in a room with 7 iron doors I am lost." "If that's all," said the king, "it shall be done at once," and he gave orders for the doors to be closed on the spot. When Scioravante saw this he returned to the old woman and said, "I will give you whatever you like if you will go into the palace, hide under the princess's bed, and slip this little piece of paper beneath her pillow, saying as you do so, 'May everyone in the palace, except the princess, fall into a sound sleep.'" The old woman demanded another 100 golden ducats, and then proceeded to carry out the magician's wishes. No sooner had she slipped the piece of paper under Cannetella's pillow than all the people in the palace fell fast asleep, and only the princess remained awake. Then Scioravante hurried to the 7 doors and opened them one after the other. Cannetella screamed with terror when she saw her husband, but no one came to her help, for all in the palace lay as if they were dead. The magician seized her in the bed on which she lay, and was going to carry her off with him, when the little piece of paper which the old woman had placed under her pillow fell on the floor. In an instant all the people in the palace woke up, and as Cannetella was still screaming for help they rushed to her rescue. They seized Scioravante and put him to death, so he was caught in the trap which he had laid for the princess, and, as is so often the case in this world, the biter himself was bit. From the Italian Kletki. End of Cannetella. Recording by Elliot Miller. www.voiceofe.com. Chapter 32 of The Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elliot Miller. The Grey Fairy Book. Edited by Andrew Lang. The Ogre. There lived once upon a time in the land of Merigliano a poor woman called Marcella, who had 6 pretty daughters, all as upright as young fir trees, and an only son called Antonio, who was so simple as to be almost an idiot. Hardly a day passed without his mother saying to him, "What are you doing, you useless creature? If you weren't too stupid to look after yourself, I would order you to leave the house and never to let me see your face again." Every day the youth committed some fresh piece of folly, till at last Marcella, losing all patience, gave him a good beating, which so startled Antonio that he took to his heels and never stopped running till it was dark and the stars were shining in the heavens. He wandered on for some time, not knowing where to go, and at last he came to a cave, at the mouth of which sat an ogre, uglier than anything you can conceive. He had a huge head and wrinkled brow, eyebrows that met, squinting eyes, a flat broad nose, and a great gash of a mouth from which 2 huge tusks stuck out. His skin was hairy, his arms enormous, his legs like sword blades, and his feet as flat as ducks. In short, he was the most hideous and laughable object in the world. But Antonio, who with all his faults was no coward, and was, moreover, a very civil spoken lad, took off his hat and said, "Good day, sir. I hope you are pretty well. Could you kindly tell me how far it is from here to the place where I wish to go?" When the ogre heard this extraordinary question he burst out laughing, and as he liked the youth's polite manners, he said to him, "Will you enter my service?" "What wages do you give?" replied Antonio. "If you serve me faithfully," returned the ogre, "I'll be bound you'll get enough wages to satisfy you." So the bargain was struck, and Antonio agreed to become the ogre's servant. He was very well treated in every way, and he had little or no work to do, with the result that in a few days he became as fat as a quail, as round as a barrel, as red as a lobster, and as impudent as a bantam cock. But after 2 years the lad got weary of this idle life, and longed desperately to visit his home again. The ogre, who could see into his heart and knew how unhappy he was, said to him one day, "My dear Antonio, I know how much you long to see your mother and sisters again, and because I love you as the apple of my eye, I am willing to allow you to go home for a visit. Therefore take this donkey, so that you may not have to go on foot, but see that you never say Bricklebrit to him, for if you do you'll be sure to regret it." Antonio took the beast without so much as saying thank you, and jumping on its back, he rode away in great haste. But he hadn't gone 200 yards when he dismounted and called out, "Bricklebrit!" No sooner had he pronounced the word than the donkey opened its mouth and poured forth rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and pearls, as big as walnuts. Antonio gazed in amazement at the sight of such wealth, and joyfully filling a huge sack with the precious stones, he mounted the donkey again and rode on till he came to an inn. Here he got down, and going straight to the landlord, he said to him, "My good man, I must ask you to stable this donkey for me. Be sure to give the poor beast plenty of oats and hay, but beware of saying the word Bricklebrit to him, for if you do I can promise you will regret it. Take this heavy sack, too, and put it carefully away for me." The landlord, who was no fool, on receiving this strange warning, and seeing the precious stones sparkling through the canvas of the sack, was most anxious to see what would happen if he used the forbidden word. So he gave Antonio an excellent dinner, with a bottle of fine old wine, and he prepared a comfortable bed for him. As soon as he saw the poor simpleton close his eyes, and had heard his lusty snores, he hurried to the stables and said to the donkey, "Bricklebrit," and the animal, as usual, poured out any number of precious stones. When the landlord saw all these treasures, he longed to get possession of so valuable an animal, and determined to steal the donkey from his foolish guest. As soon as it was light next morning Antonio awoke, and, having rubbed his eyes and stretched himself about 100 times, he called the landlord and said to him, "Come here, my friend, and produce your bill, for short reckonings make long friends." When Antonio had paid his account, he went to the stables and took out his donkey, as he thought, and fastening a sack of gravel, which the landlord had substituted for his precious stones, on the creature's back, he set out for his home. No sooner had he arrived there than he called out, "Mother, come quickly, and bring tablecloths and sheets with you, and spread them out on the ground, and you will see what wonderful treasures I have brought you." His mother hurried into the house, and opening the linen chest where she kept her daughter's wedding outfits, she took out tablecloths and sheets made of the finest linen, and spread them flat and smooth on the ground. Antonio placed the donkey on them and called out, "Bricklebrit!" But this time he met with no success, for the donkey took no more notice of the magic word than he would have done if a lyre had been twanged in his ear. 2, 3, and 4 times did Antonio pronounce "Bricklebrit," but all in vain, and he might as well have spoken to the wind. Disgusted and furious with the poor creature, he seized a thick stick and began to beat it so hard that he nearly broke every bone in its body. The miserable donkey was so distracted at such treatment that, far from pouring out precious stones, it only tore and dirtied all the fine linen. When poor Masala saw her tablecloths and sheets being destroyed, and that, instead of becoming rich, she had only been made a fool of, she seized another stick and belaboured Antonio so unmercifully with it that he fled before her, and never stopped till he reached the ogre's cave. When his master saw the lad returning in such a sorry plight, he understood at once what had happened to him, and, making no bones about the matter, he told Antonio what a fool he had been to allow himself to be so imposed upon by the landlord, and to let a worthless animal be palmed off on him instead of his magic donkey. Antonio listened humbly to the ogre's words, and vowed solemnly that he would never act so foolishly again. And so a year passed, and once more Antonio was overcome by a fit of homesickness, and felt a great longing to see his own people again. Now the ogre, although he was so hideous to look upon, had a very kind heart, and when he saw how restless and unhappy Antonio was, he at once gave him leave to go home on a visit. At parting he gave him a beautiful tablecloth, and said, "Give this to your mother, but see that you don't lose it as you lost the donkey, and till you are safely in your own house beware of saying 'tablecloth open' and 'tablecloth shut.' If you do, the misfortune be on your own head, for I have given you fair warning." Antonio set out on his journey, but hardly had he got out of sight of the cave than he had laid the tablecloth on the ground and said, "Tablecloth open." In an instant the tablecloth unfolded itself and disclosed a whole mass of precious stones and other treasures. When Antonio perceived this he said, "Tablecloth shut," and continued his journey. He came to the same inn again, and, calling the landlord to him, he told him to put the tablecloth carefully away, and whenever he did not to say "tablecloth open" or "tablecloth shut" to it. The landlord, who was a regular rogue, answered, "Just leave it to me, I will look after it as if it were my own." After he had given Antonio plenty to eat and drink, and had provided him with a comfortable bed, he went straight to the tablecloth and said, "Tablecloth open." It opened at once, and displayed such costly treasures that the landlord made up his mind on the spot to steal it. When Antonio awoke next morning, the host handed him over a tablecloth exactly like his own, and, carrying it carefully over his arm, the foolish youth went straight to his mother's house and said, "Now we shall be rich beyond the dreams of avarice, and need never go about in rags again, or lack the best of food." With these words he spread the tablecloth on the ground and said, "Tablecloth open." But he might repeat the injunction as often as he pleased. It was only waste of breath, for nothing happened. When Antonio saw this he turned to his mother and said, "That old scoundrel of a landlord has done me once more, but he will live to repent it, for if I ever enter his inn again I will make him suffer for the loss of my donkey and the other treasures he has robbed me of.' Marcella was in such a rage over her fresh disappointment that she could not restrain her impatience, and turning on Antonio she abused him soundly, and told him to get out of her sight at once, for she would never acknowledge him as a son of hers again. The poor boy was very depressed by her words, and slunk back to his master like a dog with his tail between his legs. When the ogre saw him he guessed at once what had happened. He gave Antonio a good scolding and said, 'I don't know what prevents me smashing your head in, you useless ne'er do well. You blurt everything out, and your long tongue never ceases wagging for a moment. If you had remained silent in the inn, this misfortune would never have overtaken you, so you have only yourself to blame for your present suffering.' Antonio listened to his master's words in silence, looking for all the world like a whipped dog. When he had been 3 more years in the ogre's service he had another bad fit of homesickness, and longed very much to see his mother and sisters again. So he asked for permission to go home on a visit, and it was at once granted to him. Before he set out on his journey the ogre presented him with a beautifully carved stick and said, 'Take this stick as a remembrance of me, but beware of saying "Rise up, stick," and "Lie down, stick," for if you do I can only say I wouldn't be in your shoes for something.' Antonio took the stick and said, 'Don't be in the least alarmed. I am not such a fool as you think, and know better than most people what 2 and 2 make.' 'I'm glad to hear it,' replied the ogre, 'but words are women, deeds are men. You have heard what I said, and forewarned is forearmed.' This time Antonio thanked his master warmly for all his kindness, and started on his homeward journey in great spirits. But he had not gone half a mile when he said, 'Rise up, stick.' The words were hardly out of his mouth when the stick rose and began to rain down blows on poor Antonio's back with such lightning like rapidity that he had hardly strength to call out, 'Lie down, stick!' But as soon as he uttered the words the stick lay down, and ceased beating his back black and blue. Although he had learnt a lesson at some cost to himself, Antonio was full of joy, for he saw a way now of revenging himself on the wicked landlord. Once more he arrived at the inn, and was received in the most friendly and hospitable manner by his host. Antonio greeted him cordially and said, 'My friend, will you kindly take care of this stick for me? But whatever you do, don't say "Rise up, stick." If you do you will be sorry for it, and you needn't expect any sympathy from me.' The landlord, thinking he was coming in for a third piece of good fortune, gave Antonio an excellent supper, and after he had seen him comfortably to bed, he ran to the stick, and calling to his wife to come and see the fun, he lost no time in pronouncing the words, 'Rise up, stick.' The moment he spoke the stick jumped up and beat the landlord so unmercifully that he and his wife ran screaming to Antonio, and waking him up pleaded for mercy. When Antonio saw how successful his trick had been, he said, 'I refuse to help you unless you give me all that you have stolen from me, otherwise you will be beaten to death.' The landlord, who felt himself at death's door already, cried out, 'Take back your property, only release me from this terrible stick,' and with these words he ordered the donkey, the tablecloth, and other treasures to be restored to their rightful owner. As soon as Antonio had recovered his belongings he said, 'Stick, lie down,' and it stopped beating the landlord at once. Then he took his donkey and tablecloth, and arrived safely at his home with them. This time the magic words had the desired effect, and the donkey and tablecloth provided the family with treasures untold. Antonio very soon married off his sister, made his mother rich for life, and they all lived happily ever after. From the Italian Kletki. End of The Ogre. Recording by Elliot Miller. www.voiceofe.com
Chapter 33 of the Gray Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. The Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. A Fairy's Blunder. Once upon a time there lived a fairy whose name was Dindonette. She was the best creature in the world, with the kindest heart, but she had not much sense, and was always doing things to benefit people, which generally ended in causing pain and distress to everybody concerned. No one knew this better than the inhabitants of an island far off in the midst of the sea, which, according to the laws of Fairyland, she had taken under her special protection, thinking day and night of what she could do to make the isle the pleasantest place in the whole world, as it was the most beautiful. Now what happened was this. As the fairy went about unseen from house to house, she heard everywhere children longing for the time when they would be grown up, and able, they thought, to do as they liked, and old people talking about the past, and sighing to be young again. "Is there no way to satisfy these poor things?" she thought. And then one night an idea occurred to her. "Oh, yes, of course! It has been tried before, but I will manage better than the rest with their old fountain of youth, which, after all, only made people young again. I will enchant the spring that bubbles up in the middle of the orchard, and the children that drink of it shall at once become grown men and women, and the old people return to the days of their childhood." And without stopping to consult one single other fairy who might have given her good advice, off rushed Dindonette to cast her spell over the fountain. It was the only spring of fresh water in the island, and at dawn was crowded with people of all ages come to drink at its source. Delighted at her plan for making them all happy, the fairy hid herself behind a thicket of roses, and peeped out whenever footsteps came that way. It was not long before she had ample proof of the success of her enchantments. Almost before her eyes the children put on the size and strength of adults, while the old men and women instantly became helpless tiny babies. Indeed, so pleased was she with the result of her work that she could no longer remain hidden, and went about telling everybody what she had done, and enjoying their gratitude and thanks. But after the first outburst of delight at their wishes being granted, people began to be a little frightened at the rapid effects of the magic water. It was delicious to feel yourself at the height of your power and beauty, but you would wish to keep so always. Now this was exactly what the fairy had been in too much of a hurry to arrange, and no sooner had the children become grown up, and the men and women become babies, that they all rushed on to old age at an appalling rate. The fairy only found out her mistake when it was too late to set it right. When the inhabitants of the island saw what had befallen them, they were filled with despair, and did everything they could think of to escape from such a dreadful fate. They dug wells in their places, so that they should no longer need to drink from the magic spring. But the sandy soil yielded no water, and the rainy season was already past. They stored up the dew that fell, and the juice of fruits and of herbs, but all this was as a drop in the ocean of their wants. Some threw themselves into the sea, trusting that the current might carry them to other shores. They had no boats. And a few, still more impatient, put themselves to death on the spot. The rest submitted blindly to their destiny. Perhaps the worst part of the enchantment was that the change from one age to another was so rapid that the person had no time to prepare himself for it. It would not have mattered so much if the man who stood up in the assembly of the nation to give his advice as to peace or war had looked like a baby, as long as he spoke with the knowledge and sense of a full-grown man. But, alas! with the outward form of an infant, he had taken on its helplessness and foolishness, and there was no one who could train him to better things. The end of it all was that before a month had passed the population had died out, and the fairy Dindonette, ashamed and grieved at the effects of her folly, had left the island for ever. Many centuries after, the fairy Selnozoura, who had fallen into bad health, was ordered by her doctors to make the tour of the world twice a week for change of air, and in one of these journeys she found herself at Fountain Island. Selnozoura never made these trips alone, but always took with her two children of whom she was very fond. Cornichon, a boy of 14, bought in his childhood at a slave market, and Toupette, a few months younger, who had been entrusted to the care of the fairy by her guardian, the genius Kristopo. Cornichon and Toupette were intended by Selnozoura to become husband and wife as soon as they were old enough. Meanwhile they traveled with her in a little vessel whose speed through the air was just 1,950 times greater than that of the swiftest of our ships. Struck with the beauty of the island, Selnozoura ran the vessel to ground, and leaving it in the care of the dragon which lived in the hold during the voyage, stepped on shore with her two companions. Surprised at the sight of a large town whose streets and houses were absolutely desolate, the fairy resolved to put her magic arts in practice to find out the cause. While she was thus engaged, Cornichon and Toupette wandered away by themselves, and by arrived at the fountain, whose bubbling waters looked cool and delicious on such a hot day. Scarcely had they each drunk a deep draught when the fairy, who by this time had discovered all she wished to know, hastened to the spot. "Oh, beware, beware!" she cried, the moment she saw them. "If you drink that deadly poison you will be ruined for ever." "Poison?" answered Toupette. "It is the most refreshing water I have ever tasted, and Cornichon will say so too." "Unhappy children, then I am too late. Why did you leave me? Listen, and I will tell you what has befallen the wretched inhabitants of this island, and what will befall you too. The power of fairies is great," she added, when she had finished her story, "but they cannot destroy the work of another fairy. Very shortly you will pass into the weakness and silliness of extreme old age, and all I can do for you is to make it as easy to you as possible, and to preserve you from the death that others have suffered from having no one to look after them. But the charm is working already. Cornichon is taller and more manly than he was an hour ago, and Toupette no longer looks like a little girl." It was true, but this fact did not seem to render the young people as miserable as it did Selnozoura. "Do not pity us," said Cornichon. "If we are fated to grow old so soon, let us no longer delay our marriage. What matter if we anticipate our decay, if we only anticipate our happiness too?" The fairy felt that Cornichon had reason on his side, and seeing by a glance at Toupette's face that there was no opposition to be feared from her, she answered, "Let it be so, then, but not in this dreadful place. We will return at once to Bagota, and the festivities shall be the most brilliant ever seen." They all returned to the vessel, and in a few hours the 4,500 miles that lay between the island and Bagota were passed. Everyone was surprised to see the change which the short absence had made in the young people, but as the fairy had promised absolute silence about the adventure, they were none the wiser, and busied themselves in preparing their dresses for the marriage, which was fixed for the next night. Early on the following morning the genius Kristopo arrived at the court, on one of the visits he was in the habit of paying his ward from time to time. Like the rest, he was astonished at the sudden improvement in the child. He had always been fond of her, and in a moment he fell violently in love. Hastily demanding an audience of the fairy, he laid his proposals before her, never doubting that she would give her consent to so brilliant a match. But Selnozoura refused to listen, and even hinted that in his own interest Kristopo had better turn his thoughts elsewhere. The genius pretended to agree, but instead he went straight to Toupette's room, and flew away with her through the window, at the very instant that the bridegroom was awaiting her below. When the fairy discovered what had happened, she was furious, and sent messenger after messenger to the genius in his palace at Ratibouf, commanding him to restore Toupette without delay, and threatening to make war in case of refusal. Kristopo gave no direct answer to the fairy's envoys, but kept Toupette closely guarded in a tower, where the poor girl used all her powers of persuasion to induce him to put off their marriage. All would, however, have been quite vain if, in the course of a few days, sorrow, joined to the spell of the magic water, had not altered her appearance so completely that Kristopo was quite alarmed, and declared that she needed amusement and fresh air, and that, as his presence seemed to distress her, she would be left her own mistress. But one thing he declined to do, and that was to send her back to Bagota. In the meantime, both sides had been busily collecting armies, and Kristopo had given the command of his to a famous general, while Selnozoura had placed Cornichon at the head of her forces. But before war was actually declared, Toupette's parents, who had been summoned by the genius, arrived at Ratibouf. They had never seen their daughter since they parted from her as a baby, but from time to time travelers to Bagota had brought back accounts of her beauty. What was their amazement, therefore, at finding, instead of a lovely girl, a middle-aged woman, handsome indeed, but quite faded, looking in fact older than themselves. Kristopo, hardly less astonished than they were at the sudden change, thought that it was a joke on the part of one of his courtiers, who had hidden Toupette away and put this elderly lady in her place. Bursting with rage, he sent instantly for all the servants and guards of the town, and inquired who had the insolence to play him such a trick, and what had become of their prisoner. They replied that since Toupette had been in their charge she had never left her rooms unveiled, and that during her walks in the surrounding gardens her food had been brought in and placed on her table. As she preferred to eat alone, no one had ever seen her face or knew what she was like. The servants were clearly speaking the truth, and Kristopo was obliged to believe them. But, thought he, if they have not had a hand in this, it must be the work of the fairy, and in his anger he ordered the army to be ready to march. On her side, Selnozoura of course knew what the genius had to expect, but was deeply offended when she heard of the base trick which she was believed to have invented. Her first desire was to give battle to Kristopo at once, but with great difficulty her ministers induced her to pause, to send an ambassador to Kristopo to try to arrange matters. So the Prince Zeprady departed for the court of Ratibouf, and on his way he met Cornichon, who was encamped with his army just outside the gates of Bagota. The prince showed him the fairy's written order that for the present peace must still be kept, and Cornichon, filled with longing to see Toupette once more, begged to be allowed to accompany Zeprady on his mission to Ratibouf. By this time the genius's passion for Toupette, which had caused all these troubles, had died out, and he willingly accepted the terms of peace offered by Zeprady, though he informed the prince that he still believed the fairy to be guilty of the dreadful change in the girl. To this the prince only replied that on that point he had a witness who could prove, better than anyone else, if it was Toupette or not, and desired that Cornichon should be sent for. When Toupette was told that she was to see her old lover again, her heart leapt with joy, but soon the recollection came to her of all that had happened, and she remembered that Cornichon would be changed as well as she. The moment of their meeting was not all happiness, especially on the part of Toupette, who could not forget her lost beauty, and the genius, who was present, was at last convinced that he had not been deceived, and went out to sign the treaty of peace, followed by his attendants. "Ah, Toupette, my dear Toupette!" cried Cornichon, as soon as they were left alone. "Now that we are once more united, let our past troubles be forgotten." "Our past troubles?" answered she. And what do you call our lost beauty and the dreadful future before us? You are looking 50 years older than when I last saw you, and I know too well that fate has treated me no better." "Ah, do not say that," replied Cornichon, clasping her hand. "You are different, it is true, but every age has its graces, and surely no woman of 60 was ever handsomer than you. If your eyes had been as bright as of yore, they would have matched badly with your faded skin. The wrinkles which I noticed on your forehead explain the increased fullness of your cheeks, and your throat, in withering, is elegant in decay. Thus the harmony shown by your features, even as they grow old, is the best proof of their former beauty." "Oh, monster!" cried Toupette, bursting into tears. "Is that all the comfort you can give me?" "But, Toupette," answered Cornichon, "you used to declare that you did not care for beauty as long as you had my heart." "Yes, I know," said she, "but how can you go on caring for a person who is old and plain as I?" "Toupette, Toupette," replied Cornichon, "you are only talking nonsense. My heart is as much yours as ever it was, and nothing in the world can make any difference." At this point in the conversation Prince Zeprady entered the room with the news that the genius, full of regret for his behavior, had given Cornichon full permission to depart for Bagota as soon as he liked, and to take Toupette with him, adding that though he begged they would excuse his taking leave of them before they went, he hoped before long to visit them at Bagota. Neither of the lovers slept that night, Cornichon from joy at returning home, Toupette from dread of the blow to her vanity which awaited her at Bagota. It was hopeless for Cornichon to try to console her during the journey with the reasons he had given the day before. She only grew worse and worse, and when they reached the palace went straight to her old apartments, entreating the fairy to allow both herself and Cornichon to remain concealed and to see no one. From time to time after their arrival, the fairy was taken up with the preparations for the rejoicings which were to celebrate the peace, and with the reception of the genius, who was determined to do all in his power to regain Selnozoura's lost friendship. Cornichon and Toupette were therefore left entirely to themselves, and though this was only what they wanted, still they began to feel a little neglected. At length one morning they saw from the windows that the fairy and the genius were approaching in state with all their courtiers and attendants. Toupette instantly hid herself in the darkest corner of the room, but Cornichon, forgetting that he was now no longer a boy of 14, ran to meet them. In so doing he tripped and fell, bruising one of his eyes severely. At the sight of her lover lying helpless on the floor, Toupette hastened to his side, but her feeble legs gave way under her, and she fell almost on top of him, knocking out 3 of her loosened teeth against his forehead. The fairy, who entered the room at this moment, burst into tears, and listened in silence to the genius, who hinted that by and by everything would be put right. At the last assembly of the fairies, he said, when the doings of each fairy were examined and discussed, a proposal was made to lessen, as far as possible, the mischief caused by Dindonette by enchanting the fountain, and it was decided that, as she had meant nothing but kindness, she should have the power of undoing 1/2 of the spell. Of course, she might always have destroyed the fatal fountain, which would have been best of all, but this she never thought of. Yet in spite of this her heart is so good that I am sure that the moment she hears that she is wanted she will fly to help. Only before she comes it is for you, madam, to make up your mind which of the 2 shall regain their former strength and beauty." At these words the fairy's soul sank. Both Cornichon and Toupette were equally dear to her, and how could she favor one at the cost of the other? As to the courtiers, none of the men were able to understand why she hesitated a second to declare for Toupette, while the ladies were equally strong on the side of Cornichon. But however undecided the fairy might be, it was quite different with Cornichon and Toupette. "Ah, my love!" exclaimed Cornichon, "at length I shall be able to give you the best proof of my devotion by showing you how I value the beauties of your mind above those of your body. While the most charming women of the court will fall victims to my youth and strength, I shall think of nothing but how to lay them at your feet, and pay heartfelt homage to your age and wrinkles." "Not so fast," interrupted Toupette. "I don't see why you should have it all. Why do you heap such humiliations upon me? But I will trust to the justice of the fairy, who will not treat me so." Then she entered her own rooms, and refused to leave them, in spite of the prayers of Cornichon, who begged her to let him explain. No one at the court thought or spoke of any other subject during the few days before the arrival of Dindonette, whom everybody expected to set things right in a moment. But alas, she had no idea herself what was best to be done, and always adopted the opinion of the person she was talking to. At length a thought struck her, which seemed the only way of satisfying both parties, and she asked the fairy to call together all the court and the people to hear her decision. "Happy is he," she began, "who can repair the evil he has caused, but happier he who has never caused any." As nobody contradicted this remark, she continued, "To me it is only allowed to undo one half of the mischief I have wrought. I could restore you your youth," she said to Cornichon, "or your beauty," turning to Toupette. "I will do both, and I will do neither." A murmur of curiosity arose from the crowd, while Cornichon and Toupette trembled with astonishment. "No," went on Dindonette, "never should I have the cruelty to leave one of you to decay while the other enjoys the glory of youth. And as I cannot restore you both at once to what you were, one half of each of your bodies shall become young again, while the other half goes on its way to decay. I will leave it to you to choose which half it shall be, if I shall draw a line round the waist, or a line straight down the middle of the body." She looked about her proudly, expecting applause for her clever idea, but Cornichon and Toupette were shaking with rage and disappointment, and every one else broke into shouts of laughter. In pity for the unhappy lovers, Selnozoura came forward. "Do you not think," she said, "that instead of what you propose, it would be better to let them take it in turns to enjoy their former youth and beauty for a fixed time? I am sure you could easily manage that." "What an excellent notion!" cried Dindonette. "Oh, yes, of course, that is best. Which of you shall I touch first?" "Touch her," replied Cornichon, who was always ready to give way to Toupette. "I know her heart too well to fear any change." So the fairy bent forward and touched her with her magic ring, and in one instant the old woman was a girl again. The whole court wept with joy at the sight, and Toupette ran up to Cornichon, who had fallen down in his surprise, promising to pay him long visits, and tell him of all her balls and water parties. The two fairies went to their own apartments, where the genius followed them to take his leave. "Oh dear!" suddenly cried Dindonette, breaking into the farewell speech of the genius, "I quite forgot to fix the time when Cornichon should in his turn grow young. How stupid of me! And now I fear it is too late, for I ought to have declared it before I touched Toupette with the ring. Oh dear, why did nobody warn me?" "You were so quick," replied Selnozoura, who had long been aware of the mischief the fairy had again done, "and we can only wait now till Cornichon shall have reached the utmost limits of its decay, when he will drink of the water and become a baby once more, so that Toupette will have to spend her life as a nurse, a wife, and a caretaker." After the anxiety of mind and the weakness of body to which for so long Toupette had been a prey, it seemed as if she could not amuse herself enough, and it was seldom indeed that she found time to visit poor Cornichon, though she did not cease to be fond of him, or to be kind to him. Still she was perfectly happy without him, and this poor man did not fail to see, almost blind and deaf from age though he was. But it was left to Kristopo to undo at last the work of Dindonette, and give Cornichon back the youth he had lost. And this the genius did all the more gladly, as he discovered, quite by accident, that Cornichon was in fact his son. It was on this plea that he attended the great yearly meeting of the fairies, and prayed that, in consideration of his services to so many of the members, this one boon might be granted him. Such a request had never before been heard in Fairyland, and was objected to by some of the older fairies, but both Kristopo and Selnozoura were held in such high honor that the murmurs of disgust were set aside, and the latest victim to the enchanted fountain was pronounced to be free of the spell. All that the genius asked in return was that he might accompany the fairy back to Bagota, to be present when his son assumed his proper shape. They made up their minds they would just tell Toupette that they had found a husband for her, and give her a pleasant surprise at the wedding, which was fixed for the following night. She heard the news with astonishment and many pangs for the grief which Cornichon would certainly feel at his place being taken by another, but she did not dream of disobeying the fairy, and spent the whole day wondering who the bridegroom could be. At the appointed hour a large crowd assembled at the fairy's palace, which was decorated with the sweetest flowers known only to Fairyland. Toupette had taken her place, but where was the bridegroom? "Fetch Cornichon," said the fairy to her chamberlain. But Toupette interposed. "Oh, madam, spare him, I entreat you, this bitter pain, and let him remain hidden and in peace." "It is necessary that he should be here," answered the fairy, "and he will not regret it." As she spoke, Cornichon was led in, smiling with the foolishness of extreme old age at the sight of the gay crowd. "Bring him here," commanded the fairy, waving her hand toward Toupette, who started back from surprise and horror. Selnozoura then took the hand of the poor old man, and the genius came forward and touched him 3 times with his ring, when Cornichon was transformed into a handsome young man. "May you live long," the genius said, "to enjoy happiness with your wife, and to love your father." And that was the end of the mischief wrought by the fairy Dindonette. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Long, Broad and Quick-Eye, a Bohemian Story. Once upon a time there lived a king who had an only son whom he loved dearly. Now one day the king sent for his son and said to him, "My dearest child, my hair is grey and I am old, and soon I shall feel no more the warmth of the sun, or look upon the trees and flowers. But before I die I should like to see you with a good wife, therefore marry my son as speedily as possible." "My father," replied the prince, "now and always I ask nothing better than to do your bidding, but I know of no daughter-in-law that I could give you." On hearing these words the old king drew from his pocket a key of gold and gave it to his son, saying, "Go up the staircase right up to the top of the tower, look carefully round you, and then come and tell me which you like best of all that you see." So the young man went up. He had never before been in the tower, and had no idea what it might contain. The staircase wound round and round and round till the prince was almost giddy, and every now and then he caught sight of a large room that opened out from the side, but he had been told to go to the top, and to the top he went. Then he found himself in a hall, which had an iron door at one end. This door he unlocked with his golden key, and he passed through into a vast chamber, which had a roof of blue sprinkled with golden stars, and a carpet of green silk soft as turf. 12 windows framed in gold let in the light of the sun, and on every window was painted the figure of a young girl, each more beautiful than the last. While the prince gazed at them in surprise, not knowing which he liked best, the girls began to lift their eyes and smile at him. He waited, expecting them to speak, but no sound came. Suddenly he noticed that one of the windows was covered by a curtain of white silk. He lifted it and saw before him the image of a maiden beautiful as the day and sad as the tomb, clothed in a white robe, having a girdle of silver and a crown of pearls. The prince stood and gazed at her as if he had been turned into stone, but as he looked the sadness which was on her face seemed to pass into his heart, and he cried out, "This one shall be my wife, this one and no other." As he said the words the young girl blushed and hung her head, and all the other figures vanished. The young prince went quickly back to his father and told him all he had seen and which wife he had chosen. The old man listened to him, full of sorrow, and then he spoke. "You have done ill, my son, to search out that which was hidden, and you are running to meet a great danger. This young girl has fallen into the power of a wicked sorcerer who lives in an iron castle. Many young men have tried to deliver her, and none have ever come back. But what is done is done. You have given your word, and it cannot be broken. Go, dare your fate, and return to me safe and sound." So the prince embraced his father, mounted his horse, and set forth to seek his bride. He rode on gaily for several hours, till he found himself in a wood where he had never been before, and soon lost his way among its winding paths and deep valleys. He tried in vain to see where he was. The thick trees shut out the sun, and he could not tell which was north and which was south, so that he might know what direction to make for. He felt in despair, and had quite given up all hope of getting out of this horrible place, when he heard a voice calling to him. "Hey, hey, stop a minute!" The prince turned round and saw behind him a very tall man running as fast as his legs would carry him. "Wait for me," he panted, "and take me into your service. If you do, you will never be sorry." "Who are you?" asked the prince, "and what can you do?" "Long is my name, and I can lengthen my body at will. Do you see that nest up there on the top of that pine tree? Well, I can get it for you without taking the trouble of climbing the tree." And Long stretched himself up and up and up till he was very soon as tall as the pine itself. He put the nest in his pocket, and before you could wink your eyelid he had made himself small again and stood before the prince. "Yes, you know your business," said he, "but birds' nests are no use to me. I am too old for them. Now, if you were only able to get me out of this wood, you would indeed be good for something." "Oh, there's no difficulty about that," replied Long, and he stretched himself up and up and up till he was 3 times as tall as the tallest tree in the forest. Then he looked all round and said, "We must go in this direction in order to get out of the wood," and shortening himself again he took the prince's horse by the bridle and led him along. Very soon they got clear of the forest and saw before them a wide plain ending in a pile of high rocks, covered here and there with trees, and very much like the fortifications of a town. As they left the wood behind, Long turned to the prince and said, "My lord, here comes my comrade. You should take him into your service too, as you will find him a great help." "Well, call him then, so that I can see what sort of a man he is." "He is a little too far off for that," replied Long. "He would hardly hear my voice, and he couldn't be here for some time yet, as he has so much to carry. I think I had better go and bring him myself." And this time he stretched himself to such a height that his head was lost in the clouds. He made 2 or 3 strides, took his friend on his back, and set him down before the prince. The newcomer was a very fat man and as round as a barrel. "Who are you?" asked the prince, "and what can you do?" "Your worship, Broad is my name, and I can make myself as wide as I please." "Let me see how you manage it." "Run, my lord, as fast as you can, and hide yourself in the wood," cried Broad, and he began to swell himself out. The prince did not understand why he should run to the wood, but when he saw Long flying towards it, he thought he had better follow his example. He was only just in time, for Broad had so suddenly inflated himself that he very nearly knocked over the prince and his horse too. He covered all the space for acres round. You would have thought he was a mountain. At length Broad ceased to expand, drew a deep breath that made the whole forest tremble, and shrank into his usual size. "You have made me run away," said the prince, "but it is not every day one meets with a man of your sort. I will take you into my service." So the 3 companions continued their journey, and when they were drawing near the rocks they met a man whose eyes were covered by a bandage. "Your Excellency," said Long, "this is our third comrade. You will do well to take him into your service, and, I assure you, you will find him worth his salt." "Who are you?" asked the prince, "and why are your eyes bandaged? You can never see your way." "It is just the contrary, my lord. It is because I see only too well that I am forced to bandage my eyes. Even so I see as well as people who have no bandage. When I take it off, my eyes pierce through everything. Everything I look at catches fire, or if it cannot catch fire, it falls into 1,000 pieces. They call me Quickeye." And so saying, he took off his bandage and turned towards the rock. As he fixed his eyes upon it, a crack was heard, and in a few moments it was nothing but a heap of sand. In the sand something might be detected, glittering brightly. Quickeye picked it up and brought it to the prince. It turned out to be a lump of pure gold. "You are a wonderful creature," said the prince, "and I should be a fool not to take you into my service. But since your eyes are so good, tell me if I am very far from the Iron Castle, and what is happening there just now." "If you were travelling alone," replied Quickeye, "it would take you at least a year to get to it, but as we are with you we shall arrive there tonight. Just now they are preparing supper." "There is a princess in the castle. Do you see her?" "A wizard keeps her in high tower, guarded by iron bars." "Ah, help me to deliver her," cried the prince, and they promised they would. Then they all set out through the grey rocks by the breach made by the eyes of Quickeye, and passed over great mountains and through deep woods, and every time they met with any obstacle the three friends contrived somehow to put it aside. As the sun was setting, the prince beheld the towers of the Iron Castle, and before it sank beneath the horizon he was crossing the iron bridge which led to the gates. He was only just in time, for no sooner had the sun disappeared altogether than the bridge drew itself up and the gates shut themselves. There was no turning back now. The prince put up his horse in the stable, where everything looked as if a guest was expected, and then the whole party marched straight up to the castle. In the court, in the stables, and all over the great halls they saw a number of men richly dressed, but every one turned into stone. They crossed an endless set of rooms, all opening into each other, till they reached the dining hall. It was brilliantly lighted. The table was covered with wine and fruit, and was laid for 4. They waited a few minutes, expecting someone to come, but as nobody did, they sat down and began to eat and drink, for they were very hungry. When they had done their supper, they looked about for some place to sleep, but suddenly the door burst open, and the wizard entered the hall. He was old and humpbacked, with a bald head and a grey beard that fell to his knees. He wore a black robe, and instead of a belt 3 iron circlets clasped his waist. He led by the hand a lady of wonderful beauty, dressed in white, with a girdle of silver and a crown of pearls, but her face was pale and sad as death itself. The prince knew her in an instant, and moved eagerly forward, but the wizard gave him no time to speak, and said, "I know why you are here. Very good. You may have her, if for 3 nights following you can prevent her making her escape. If you fail in this, you and your servants will all be turned into stone, like those who have come before you." And offering the princess a chair, he left the hall. The prince could not take his eyes from the princess, she was so lovely. He began to talk to her, but she neither answered nor smiled, and sat as if she were made of marble. He seated himself by her, and determined not to close his eyes that night for fear she should escape him. And in order that she should be doubly guarded, Long stretched himself like a strap all around the room. Broad took his stand by the door and puffed himself out, so that not even a mouse could slip by, and Quickeye leant against a pillar which stood in the middle of the floor and supported the roof. But in half a second they were all sound asleep, and they slept sound the whole night long. In the morning, at the first peep of dawn, the prince awoke with a start, but the princess was gone. He aroused his servants and implored them to tell him what he must do. "Calm yourself, my lord," said Quickeye. "I have found her already. 100 miles from here there is a forest. In the middle of the forest an old oak, and on the top of the oak an acorn. This acorn is the princess. If Long will take me on his shoulders we shall soon bring her back." And sure enough, in less time than it takes to walk round a cottage, they had returned from the forest, and Long presented the acorn to the prince. "Now, your excellency, throw it on the ground." The prince obeyed, and was enchanted to see the princess appear at his side. But when the sun peeped for the first time over the mountains, the door burst open as before, and the wizard entered with a loud laugh. Suddenly he caught sight of the princess. His face darkened, he uttered a low growl, and one of the iron circlets gave way with a crash. He seized the young girl by the hand and bore her away with him. All that day the prince wandered about the castle, studying the curious treasures it contained, but everything looked as if life had suddenly come to a standstill. In one place he saw a prince who had been turned into stone in the act of brandishing a sword round which his two hands were clasped. In another the same doom had fallen upon a knight in the act of running away. In a third a serving man was standing, eternally trying to convey a piece of beef to his mouth, and all around them were others, still preserving for evermore the attitudes they were in when the wizard had commanded, "From henceforth be turned into marble." In the castle and round the castle all was dismal and desolate. Trees there were, but without leaves; fields there were, but no grass grew on them. There was one river, but it never flowed, and no fish lived in it. No flowers blossomed, and no birds sang. 3 times during the day food appeared as if by magic for the prince and his servants, and it was not until supper was ended that the wizard appeared, as on the previous evening, and delivered the princess into the care of the prince. All 4 determined that this time they would keep awake at any cost. But it was no use. Off they went as they had done before, and when the prince awoke the next morning the room was again empty. With a pang of shame he rushed to find Quickeye. "Awake! Awake! Quickeye! Do you know what has become of the princess?" Quickeye rubbed his eyes and answered, "Yes, I see her. 200 miles from here there is a mountain. In this mountain is a rock. In the rock a precious stone. This stone is the princess. Long shall take me there, and we will be back before you can turn round." So Long took him on his shoulders, and they set out. At every stride they covered 20 miles, and as they drew near Quickeye fixed his burning eyes on the mountain. In an instant it split into 1,000 pieces, and in one of these sparkled the precious stone. They picked it up and brought it to the prince, who flung it hastily down, and as the stone touched the floor the princess stood before him. When the wizard came his eyes shot forth flames of fury. Crick crack was heard, and another of his iron bands broke and fell. He seized the princess by the hand and led her off, growling louder than ever. All that day things went on exactly as they had done the day before. After supper the wizard brought back the princess, and looking him straight in the eyes he said, "We shall see which of us 2 will gain the prize after all." That night they struggled their very hardest to keep awake, and even walked about instead of sitting down, but it was quite useless. One after another they had to give in, and for the 3rd time the princess slipped through their fingers. When morning came it was as usual the prince who awoke the first, and as usual the princess being gone he rushed to Quickeye. Get up, Quickeye, and tell me, where is the princess?" Quickeye looked about for some time without answering. "Oh, my lord, she is far, very far. 300 miles away there lies a black sea. In the middle of this sea there is a little shell, and in the middle of the shell is fixed a gold ring. That gold ring is the princess. But do not vex your soul, we will get her. Only to-day Long must take Broad with him. He will be wanted badly." So Long took Quickeye on one shoulder and Broad on the other, and they set out. At each stride they left 30 miles behind them. When they reached the Black Sea, Quickeye showed them the spot where they must seek the shell. But though Long stretched down his hand as far as it would go, he could not find the shell, for it lay at the bottom of the sea. "Wait a moment, comrades, it will be all right. I will help you," said Broad. Then he swelled himself out so that you would have thought the world could hardly have held him, and stooping down he drank. He drank so much at every mouthful that only a minute or so passed before the water had sunk enough for Long to put his hand to the bottom. He soon found the shell and pulled the ring out. But time had been lost, and Long had a double burden to carry. The dawn was breaking fast before they got back to the castle, where the prince was waiting for them in an agony of fear. Soon the first rays of the sun were seen, peeping over the tops of the mountains. The door burst open, and finding the prince standing alone, the wizard broke into peals of wicked laughter. But as he laughed a loud crash was heard, The window fell into 1,000 pieces, a gold ring glittered in the air, and the princess stood before the enchanter. For Quickeye, who was watching from afar, had told Long of the terrible danger now threatening the prince, and Long, summoning all his strength for one gigantic effort, had thrown the ring right through the window. The wizard shrieked and howled with rage till the whole castle trembled to its foundations. Then a crash was heard, the third band split in two, and a crow flew out of the window. Then the princess at length broke the enchanted silence, and, blushing like a rose, gave the prince her thanks for her unlooked-for deliverance. But it was not only the princess who was restored to life by the flight of the wicked black crow. The marble figures became men once more, and took up their occupations just as they had left them off. The horses neighed in the stables, the flowers blossomed in the garden, the birds flew in the air, the fish darted in the water. Everywhere you looked all was life, all was joy. And the knights who had been turned into stone came in a body to offer their homage to the prince who had set them free. "Do not thank me," he said, "for I have done nothing. Without my faithful servants Long, Broad, and Quickeye, I should even have been as one of you." With these words he bade them farewell, and departed with the princess and his faithful companions for the kingdom of his father. The old king, who had long since given up all hope, wept for joy at the sight of his son, and insisted that the wedding should take place as soon as possible. All the knights who had been enchanted in the iron castle were invited to the ceremony, and after it had taken place, Long, Broad, and Quickeye took leave of the young couple, saying that they were going to look for more work. The prince offered them all their hearts could desire if they would only remain with him, but they replied that an idle life would not please them, and that they could never be happy unless they were busy, so they went away to seek their fortunes, and for all I know are seeking still. Conte populaire, traduit par Louis Léger, Paris, Leroux, éditeur. End of Long, Broad, and Quickeye. Recording by Michaela O'Connor.
Chapter 35 of the Grey Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melanie Hughes. The Grey Fairy Book. Edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 35. Prunella. There was once upon a time a woman who had an only daughter. When the child was about 7 years old, she used to pass every day on her way to school an orchard where there was a wild plum tree with delicious ripe plums hanging from the branches. Each morning the child would pick one and would put it in her pocket to eat at school. For this reason she was called Prunella. Now the orchard belonged to a witch. One day the witch noticed the child gathering a plum as she passed along the road. Prunella did it quite innocently, not knowing that she was doing wrong in taking the fruit that hung close to the roadside. But the witch was furious, and next day hid herself behind the hedge, and when Prunella came past and put out her hand to pluck the fruit, she jumped out and seized her by the arm. "Ah, you little thief!" she exclaimed, "I have caught you at last. Now you will have to pay for your misdeeds." The poor child, half dead with fright, implored the old woman to forgive her, assuring her that she did not know she had done wrong, and promising never to do it again. But the witch had no pity, and she dragged Prunella into her house, where she kept her till the time should come when she could have her revenge. As the years passed, Prunella grew up into a very beautiful girl. Now her beauty and goodness, instead of softening the witch's heart, aroused her hatred and jealousy. One day she called Prunella to her and said, "Take this basket to the well and bring it back to me filled with water. If you don't, I will kill you." The girl took the basket, went and let it down into the well again and again, but her work was lost labour. Each time as she drew up the basket, the water streamed out of it. At last, in despair, she gave it up, and leaning against the well she began to cry bitterly, when suddenly she heard a voice at her side saying, "Prunella, why are you crying?" Turning round, she beheld a handsome youth who looked kindly at her as if he was sorry for her trouble. "Who are you?" she asked, "and how do you know my name?"
I'm the son of the witch, he replied, and my name is Bensiabel. I know that she is determined that you shall die, but I promise you that she shall not carry out her wicked plan. Will you give me a kiss if I fill your basket?" "No," said Prunella, "I will not give you a kiss, because you are the son of a witch." "Very well," replied the youth sadly. "Give me your basket, and I will fill it for you." And he dipped it into the well, and the water stayed in it. Then the girl returned to the house, carrying the basket filled with water. When the witch saw it, she became white with rage, and exclaimed, "Bensiabel must have helped you." And Prunella looked down, and said nothing. "Well, we shall see who will win in the end," said the witch, in a great rage. The following day she called the girl to her, and said, "Take this sack of wheat. I am going out for a little. By the time I return, I shall expect you to have made it into bread. If you have not done it, I will kill you." Having said this, she left the room, closing and locking the door behind her. Poor Prunella did not know what to do. It was impossible for her to grind the wheat, prepare the dough, and bake the bread, all in the short time that the witch would be away. At first she set to work bravely, but when she saw how hopeless her task was, she threw herself on a chair and began to weep bitterly. She was roused from her despair by hearing Bensiabel's voice at her side, saying, "Prunella, Prunella, do not weep like that. If you will give me a kiss, I will make the bread, and you will be saved." "I will not kiss the son of a witch," replied Prunella. But Bensiabel took the wheat from her, and ground it, and made the dough, and when the witch returned, the bread was ready baked in the oven. Turning to the girl with fury in her voice, she said, "Bensiabel must have been here and helped you." And Prunella looked down and said nothing. "We shall see who will win in the end," said the witch, and her eyes blazed with anger. Next day she called the girl to her, and said, "Go to my sister, who lives across the mountains. She will give you a casket, which you must bring back to me." This she said, knowing that her sister, who was a still more cruel and wicked witch than herself, would never allow the girl to return, but would imprison her and starve her to death. But Prunella did not suspect anything, and set out quite cheerfully. On the way she met Bensiabel. "Where are you going, Prunella?" he asked. "I'm going to the sister of my mistress, from whom I am to fetch a casket." "Oh, poor girl," said Bensiabel. "You are being sent straight to your death. Give me a kiss, and I will save you." But again Prunella answered as before, "I will not kiss the son of a witch." "Nevertheless, I will save your life," said Bensiabel, "for I love you better than myself. Take this flagon of oil, this loaf of bread, this piece of rope, and this broom, and when you reach the witch's house, oil the hinges of the door with the contents of the flagon, and throw the loaf of bread to the great fierce mastiff, who will come to meet you. When you've passed the dog, you'll see in the courtyard a miserable woman trying in vain to let down a bucket into the well with her plaited hair. You must give her the rope. In the kitchen you will find a still more miserable woman trying to clean the hearth with her tongue. To her you must give the broom. You will see the casket on the top of a cupboard. Take it as quickly as you can, and leave the house without a moment's delay. If you do all this exactly as I've told you, you will not be killed." So Prunella, having listened carefully to his instructions, did just what he told her. She reached the house, oiled the hinges of the door, threw the loaf to the dog, gave the poor woman at the well the rope, and the woman in the kitchen the broom, caught up the casket from the top of the cupboard, and fled with it out of the house. But the witch heard her as she ran away, and rushing to the window, called out to the woman in the kitchen, "Kill that thief, I tell you!" But the woman replied, "I will not kill her, for she has given me a broom, whereas you forced me to clean the hearth with my tongue." Then the witch called out in fury to the woman at the well, "Take the girl, I tell you, and fling her into the water and drown her." But the woman answered, "No, I will not drown her, for she gave me this rope, whereas you forced me to use my hair to let down the bucket to draw water." Then the witch shouted to the dog to seize the girl and hold her fast, but the dog answered, "No, I will not seize her, for she gave me a loaf of bread, whereas you let me starve with hunger." The witch was so angry that she nearly choked, as she called out, "Door, bang upon her and keep her a prisoner." But the door answered, "I won't, for she has oiled my hinges so that they move quite easily, whereas you left them all rough and rusty." And so Prunella escaped, and, with the casket under her arm, reached the house of her mistress, who, as you may believe, was as angry as she was surprised to see the girl standing before her, looking more beautiful than ever. Her eyes flashed as in furious tones she asked her, "Did you meet Bensiabel?" But Prunella looked down and said nothing. "We shall see," said the witch, "who will win in the end. Listen, there are 3 cocks in the hen house. One is yellow, one is black, and the third is white. If one of them crows during the night, you must tell me which one it is. Woe to you if you make a mistake. I will gobble you up in one mouthful." Now Bensiabel was in the room next to the one where Prunella slept. At midnight she awoke, hearing a cock crow. "Which one was that?" shouted the witch. Then, trembling, Prunella knocked on the wall and whispered, "Bensiabel, Bensiabel, tell me which cock crowed." "Will you give me a kiss if I tell you?" he whispered back through the wall. But she answered, "No." Then he whispered back to her, "Nevertheless, I will tell you. It was the yellow cock that crowed." The witch, who had noticed the delay in Prunella's answer, approached her door, calling angrily, "Answer at once, or I will kill you." So Prunella answered, "It was the yellow cock that crowed." And the witch stamped her foot and gnashed her teeth. Soon after another cock crowed. "Tell me now which one it is," called the witch, and prompted by Bensiabel, Prunella answered, "That's the black cock." A few minutes after, the crowing was heard again, and the voice of the witch demanding, "Which one was that?" And again Prunella implored Bensiabel to help her, but this time he hesitated, for he hoped that Prunella might forget that he was a witch's son and promise to give him a kiss. And as he hesitated, he heard an agonized cry from the girl, "Bensiabel, Bensiabel, save me! The witch is coming! She is close to me! I hear the gnashing of her teeth!" With a bound, Bensiabel opened the door and flung himself against the witch. He pulled her back with such force that she stumbled, and falling headlong, dropped down dead at the foot of the stairs. Then, at last, Prunella was touched by Bensiabel's goodness and kindness to her, and she became his wife, and they lived happily ever after. End of chapter 35. Recording by Melanie Hughes. End of The Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang.